Imagine a world where every meal you eat carries a silent clock ticking away in the background, counting down the minutes until it spoils. No refrigerator humming softly in the corner, no freezer stocked with food for weeks to come. For most of human history, this was life. The survival of your family depended not just on growing or hunting enough food, but on figuring out how to keep it from rotting before you could eat it. From the moment people first began storing harvests and preserving meats, an endless battle against time, pests, and decay began. And out of this struggle came some of the most ingenious, resourceful, and sometimes surprising methods of food preservation the world has ever known. Tonight, we're going to explore those stories. You'll hear about salt so valuable it shaped economies, smoke curling around meats in ancient huts, and ice carried across mountains to cool the feasts of kings. You'll learn how honey could keep fruit safe for months, how soldiers survived long campaigns on strange preserved rations, and how entire civilizations rose and fell on their ability to store food. This is the history of how people preserved food before refrigerators, and much more. Before we dive in, I'd love to invite you to be part of this journey. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories that blend history with calm narration, perfect for drifting off to sleep. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What periods of history interest you the most? Do you prefer ancient empires, medieval villages, or the modern world on the edge of industrial change? And when do you usually listen? While falling asleep at night, or perhaps during a quiet break in the day? Your thoughts and preferences help shape the stories we tell together. This channel, History for Sleep, is built not only on the past, but also on the shared curiosity of listeners like you. So settle in, find a comfortable spot, and let your thoughts gently slow down. Tonight, let's step into a world where ingenuity and necessity met in remarkable ways, where every method of food preservation tells a story of survival, culture, and resilience. By the end, you'll see your refrigerator in a whole new light as the final chapter in an incredibly long human story. Now let's begin with Chapter 1, the constant struggle against spoilage. For most of human history, food was never something taken for granted. Each meal was a small triumph over nature's forces, because the truth was simple. The moment food was harvested, slaughtered, or prepared, it began to decay. Unlike today, when refrigerators hum in nearly every home and supermarket shelves, overflow with processed goods that can last for months, our ancestors lived in a world where time was their greatest enemy. Fresh milk soured within hours on a warm day. Meat began to rot almost as soon as it was butchered. Fruits bruised and blackened. Bread molded. And behind every small crack, every whiff of damp air, or every hidden crevice, there lurked insects, rodents, and bacteria waiting to claim what humans had gathered. To survive, people had to fight this battle daily, using cleverness, tradition, and endless trial and error. The struggle was not only about comfort or taste, it was about life and death. In societies where famine was a constant threat, the inability to preserve food meant that a bad harvest or harsh winter could bring starvation. A community might thrive in the summer months, when fruits ripened and animals were plentiful, only to face hunger and sickness as the cold closed in. Preservation was the bridge between seasons, the lifeline that stretched abundance from one moment into security for the next. Without preservation, human settlements could never have grown beyond small nomadic groups. Villages, towns, and eventually cities depended on stockpiling. Without methods to keep grain, dried fish, or cured meats safe from spoilage, civilization as we know it could never have taken shape. In this way, food preservation became one of the quiet foundations of human progress. It was not a single invention, like the wheel or writing, but rather a set of countless techniques discovered independently across the globe. Some were simple, leaving food in the sun to dry, or burying it in cool earth. Others required more experimentation, like soaking vegetables in brine until their flavors changed completely, or smoking fish until it turned dark and leathery. What these methods had in common was their purpose: to wrestle precious time away from decay and to give people the chance to plan, trade, and survive. The risk of spoilage was not just unpleasant, it could be deadly. Eating food that had turned bad could lead to sickness, sometimes severe enough to kill. In eras before people understood germs, the causes of illness were mysterious, but the connection between spoiled food and human suffering was impossible to miss. A family who ate tainted meat might be struck with fever, vomiting, and weakness, unable to work in the fields the next day. For communities living on the edge of survival, such illnesses could ripple outward, undermining the very stability of the group. This constant awareness pushed people to treat food carefully, to respect the fragile line between nourishment and poison. The fight against spoilage also shaped human culture and economy. The quest for salt, for instance, was not just about seasoning meals, but about ensuring food could last through the lean months. Salt mines and trade routes became as valuable as gold. The demand for spices in medieval Europe was not only about exotic flavors, but also about masking the taste of preserved or slightly spoiled food. Wars were fought, fortunes made, and empires expanded over the ability to secure reliable preservation. In this sense, the story of food preservation is inseparable from the story of human ambition and power. At the household level, preservation often fell to those responsible for preparing meals, usually women in many cultures, who inherited generations of knowledge passed down like sacred tradition. A mother might teach her daughter how to dry apples by stringing them near the hearth, or how to press cabbage into a jar with salt to ferment slowly into something that would still be edible months later. Each household became its own laboratory, blending old wisdom with improvisation. A failed attempt could mean wasted food, or worse, illness. A successful one could mean survival through winter. Over time, these practices hardened into cultural rituals, foods tied not just to necessity, but also to memory and celebration. Communities also developed communal ways of protecting their harvests. In some villages, granaries were guarded structures, built with thick walls to keep out moisture and rats. In others, ice or snow was packed into underground pits to last through warmer months, serving as a primitive form of refrigeration. Even these shared methods required constant vigilance. A leaking roof could mean mold spreading through precious grain. A single infestation could destroy stores meant to feed dozens of families. The stakes were always high, and the effort never-ending. To truly appreciate the refrigerator humming quietly in your kitchen today, it helps to imagine life without it. Picture living through a harsh winter, knowing that the only food your family has is what you manage to preserve. Every loaf of bread baked in the autumn and stored for later would be rationed carefully. Every piece of salted meat would be guarded as though it were treasure. The taste of fresh fruit in spring would not just be a delight, but a miracle after months of eating dried or pickled versions. In that sense, food preservation was not only about survival, but also about shaping the rhythm of life itself, the cycles of hunger and satisfaction, of scarcity and abundance. And yet, despite the constant pressure of spoilage, people did not simply resign themselves to endless fear. Instead, they experimented and innovated, finding ways to stretch nature's limits. This resilience, born from necessity, became one of humanity's greatest strengths. The methods they developed, whether salting, smoking, fermenting, or storing in cool places, were not merely technical tricks. They were acts of creativity, of determination, of refusing to accept that the forces of decay would always win. As we move forward, we will explore each of these methods in detail, from the shimmering crystals of salt that became worth more than silver, to the smoky chambers where fish and meat hung for days each. Chapter reveals not only a method of preservation, but also the cultural world built around it. Food preservation was never just about keeping hunger at bay. It was about shaping identity, economy, and tradition. It was about finding security in an insecure world. And above all, it was about survival, the most universal human challenge of all. Now that we understand why the struggle against spoilage mattered so deeply, we can step into the methods themselves. Let's begin with one of the most powerful tools ever discovered in this fight: salt, the mineral that shaped history. If there is one substance that shaped the course of human history as much as food itself, it is salt. Today, it may seem ordinary, a small white grain sprinkled casually over dinner without a second thought. But for most of history, salt was a treasure. It was wealth, power, and survival packed into tiny crystals. Without salt, people could not preserve food effectively, and without preservation, societies could not thrive beyond the limits of immediate abundance. Salt became more than a seasoning. It was the cornerstone of preservation, the reason for trade routes, the source of wars, and the foundation of empires. The magic of salt lies in its ability to draw moisture out of food. Microorganisms, those unseen culprits of spoilage, need water to survive and multiply. By heavily salting meat or fish, people learned that they could make these foods inhospitable to bacteria, dramatically slowing down decay. A side effect of this process was taste foods not only lasted longer, but they also developed unique, often prized flavors. Salted fish from the North Atlantic, salted meats carried by soldiers, salted vegetables stored in jars, all became staples of diets across the world. Salt was both a shield against hunger and a doorway to culinary traditions that persist to this day. The value of salt was so great that entire economies were built upon it. In ancient China, governments controlled salt production to ensure a steady supply and to collect revenue from its sale. In the Roman Empire, salt was so crucial that soldiers were sometimes paid in it, giving rise to the word salary. Roman roads themselves often followed routes designed to transport salt from coastal areas or mines to inland regions. A single caravan loaded with salt could be worth a fortune, and the control of these supplies gave rulers immense power. Cities rose where salt was accessible, and great efforts were made to mine, harvest, and guard it. Salt mines themselves became legendary. In Central Europe, the mines of Hallstatt provided not only a steady supply, but also archaeological treasures that tell us how far back salt's importance goes. Ancient bodies preserved by salt in those mines show that people were mining it thousands of years ago, carrying heavy blocks through dangerous tunnels, all to keep their communities fed through the seasons. In Africa, camel caravans carried slabs of salt across the Sahara, linking distant regions through trade. A single piece of salt could be traded for gold, grain, or even human lives. In medieval Europe, salt taxes funded kings and fueled revolts, making this humble mineral a political tool as well as a necessity. For the average household, salt was indispensable. Imagine living in a fishing village along a cold northern coast. Freshly caught fish would spoil within a day if not consumed. By rubbing salt into the flesh and layering it in barrels, families could transform perishable catches into durable stores. These barrels could be shipped hundreds of miles inland, feeding towns and armies far removed from the sea. In farming communities, when a pig was slaughtered in autumn, salting ensured that the meat could last well into the winter months, when fresh meat was scarce. Salt was the difference between feasting and famine, between survival and starvation. The cultural role of salt went even further. In many traditions, sharing salt with a guest was a sign of hospitality and trust, a symbolic gesture that went beyond food. In the Bible and other ancient texts, salt is mentioned repeatedly, symbolizing purity, preservation, and even divine covenants. To spill salt was seen as bad luck in some cultures, a superstition that lingers even today when people toss a pinch of spilled salt over their shoulder. This reverence for salt was born from its role in survival. It was not just a seasoning, but life itself, preserved in crystalline form. Preservation by salting was not without challenges. Salt could be expensive, especially in regions far from sources. Too much salt could make food unpalatable, so balancing flavor with preservation became an art. Over time, people experimented with combining salt with other methods, like smoking or drying, to enhance both longevity and taste. Salted cod, for example, became one of the most important trade items in Europe. Fishermen from places like Portugal, Norway, and Newfoundland salted their catches heavily, producing stockfish and bacalhau that could travel across oceans and last for months, even years. These fish fed sailors, soldiers, and settlers, fueling expansion and exploration. Wars were fought over salt. Napoleon's armies suffered when blockades cut off access to it. During the American Civil War, control of saltworks was a strategic priority, as soldiers depended on salted meats. In each case, the ability or inability to secure salt had a direct impact on military campaigns and the survival of populations. Salt was not just a kitchen item, but a resource as critical as iron, grain, or water. Salt also influenced migration and settlement. Communities often grew around salt springs or mines, where access to preservation made life sustainable. The Great Salt Lake in Utah, the salt pans of India, the sea salt beds of France, all became focal points for settlement and production. In coastal regions, families collected seawater and boiled it down to extract the precious mineral. Entire towns became centers of salt production, where workers toiled in hot, briny pools or dug deep into the earth, hauling out heavy crystals that would sustain life far beyond their own borders. What is remarkable is that across the world, in every culture, salt was discovered and revered independently. From the Mayans in Central America to the Egyptians along the Nile, salt was both a preservative and a sacred substance. The Egyptians used it not only to preserve food, but also in their mummification rituals, extending preservation from the kitchen to the afterlife. The universality of salt's role reminds us of the common human struggle against time and decay, and the shared ingenuity that arose from it. To understand salt's impact, imagine life in a medieval village. Winter is approaching, and the harvest has been gathered. Without preservation, the grain might rot, the vegetables wither, and the meat spoil. But with salt, the villagers can pack away barrels of pork, brine their cabbages, and ensure that, come February, when the fields are frozen and barren, they will still have nourishment. A pinch of salt in the stew was more than flavor. It was the memory of autumn abundance, carried safely into the hunger of winter. Even today, in our world of refrigerators and global trade, salted foods remain beloved. We still savor cured hams, salty cheeses, pickled vegetables, and fish preserved in brine. What once was necessity has become tradition, taste, and culture. The persistence of salted foods in our diets is a living reminder of the centuries when salt was the most powerful weapon in the battle against spoilage. As we leave behind the story of salt, we step into another ancient and equally vital method of preservation, the practice of drying food under the sun and wind, a technique as old as humanity itself, and one that remains essential across the world to this day. Long before people discovered the power of salt, and long before they mastered fermentation or complex storage methods, they found an ally in the simplest forces of nature, the sun and the wind. Drying food is perhaps the oldest preservation technique in human history, a method so ancient that it predates written records. It required no special tools, no rare minerals, and no deep knowledge of chemistry, only patience and the willingness to let time and weather do their work. Yet this simplicity made drying one of the most powerful tools against spoilage, a method that sustained humanity for millennia and continues to be essential in many parts of the world today. The principle behind drying is straightforward. Remove water, and you remove the conditions in which bacteria, mold, and insects thrive. Like salt, drying deprives microorganisms of the moisture they need to multiply. Without water, the decay that would otherwise take hold is slowed dramatically. What is left behind is food transformed into something new, chewier, harder, sometimes sweeter, and far longer lasting. Sunlight and air currents became the natural partners of humanity in the battle against spoilage, turning fresh abundance into stores of security. Imagine ancient hunters returning with strips of meat from a successful hunt. In warm, dry climates, they discovered that simply hanging those strips on rocks or branches under the blazing sun transformed the meat. It grew tough and leathery, but did not rot, even days or weeks later. This was the birth of jerky, a food so resilient and portable that it would feed travelers, soldiers, and herders across thousands of years. Similarly, fishermen along coasts realized that their catches, if laid out under the sun and exposed to the wind, would harden into stockfish-like, durable, and almost immortal. These discoveries allowed food to travel across time and space, sustaining families in lean seasons and fueling the expansion of cultures and empires. Fruits and vegetables, too, lent themselves to this transformation. Grapes became raisins, plums became prunes, figs shriveled into sweet morsels that could be carried in sacks. Apples could be sliced and strung into garlands hung near hearths or laid across rooftops, where the heat of the sun and the movement of air slowly stripped them of moisture. Dried fruit not only lasted through the winter months, but also concentrated natural sugars, creating energy-rich foods that were as prized for their taste as for their longevity. In desert climates, dates were dried into staples that nourished caravans traveling across vast stretches of sand, where fresh food was scarce and survival depended on portable, long-lasting rations. Drying was not just about practicality, it also shaped the flavors and textures of food. Dried meats took on smoky, earthy notes. Dried fruits became sweeter and more intense. Vegetables dried for soups and stews contributed concentrated bursts of flavor that fresh produce could not match. What began as a necessity gradually became a matter of taste, embedding itself in culinary traditions. Even today, dried herb sage, thyme, rosemary, oregano remain essential for seasoning, a direct continuation of ancient practices when people dried leaves and seeds to ensure they would have access to flavor in the depths of winter. The techniques varied widely depending on climate and culture. In hot, arid regions, the sun was strong enough to dry food quickly. The Middle East, with its deserts and dry winds, became a center of dried fruit traditions that still endure. In cooler or wetter climates, people adapted by drying food indoors, near hearths, or by building racks that allowed air to circulate around the food. In some cases, drying was combined with smoking, using both heat and airflow to remove moisture while adding preservative compounds from the smoke. These combined methods often produced foods that became delicacies in their own right. Communal drying was also a feature of village life. In some European farming communities, neighbors shared drying barns or lofts, where apples, pears, and berries were laid out together. Families worked side by side, preparing harvests for the long months ahead, each aware that their survival depended on the success of these efforts. The sight of garlands of drying food hanging from rafters or across windows was a symbol of preparation, security, and the rhythm of seasonal life. When snow blanketed the ground, those shriveled fruits and leathery meats became reminders of the summer sun that had made them possible. But drying had challenges, too. If food was not dried thoroughly, it could still spoil, sometimes with dangerous consequences. A half-dried piece of meat might develop mold or harbor insects, putting the family who ate it at risk. Rain or humidity could ruin days of work, forcing people to start over or lose valuable stores. Even pests like birds or rodents could threaten the drying process, drawn by the scent of food exposed in the open air. Success required vigilance, knowledge, and often a bit of luck with the weather. Over time, techniques improved. Racks were built higher, netting was used to protect from animals, and specialized drying houses were constructed to keep out moisture while still allowing airflow. The importance of drying food cannot be overstated when we think about human migration and exploration. Dried foods were light and portable, making them ideal for long journeys. Nomadic peoples relied on dried meat and dried milk products as they traveled across steppe and desert. Sailors carried dried fish, beans, and fruit on long sea voyages, where fresh supplies were impossible to keep. Armies marched with jerky and hard biscuits, feeding campaigns that stretched far from supply bases. The resilience of dried food made it not only a survival tool, but also a force multiplier, enabling human beings to push beyond their immediate environments. Cultural traditions built around dried foods still echo in our lives today. In Asia, dried seaweed remains a staple, rich in nutrients and easily stored. In South America, the practice of drying potatoes created chuno, a lightweight and durable food that sustained Andean civilizations for centuries. In Africa, sun-dried grains and legumes became the foundation of stews and porridges. Every region, every climate, found its own way to harness the sun and wind, leaving behind a legacy of foods that still appear on our tables. Even modern dehydrated camping meals, packed into shiny foil bags, are descendants of these ancient techniques. One fascinating aspect of drying is its connection to memory and tradition. For many families, the act of preparing dried food was tied to seasonal cycles. The first fruits of summer were often eaten fresh, but later harvests were laid aside for drying. The sight of jars filling with dried goods marked the turning of the year, each one a promise of sustenance through the cold or dry months to come. In this way, drying was not only about defeating spoilage, it was about creating continuity, a thread of abundance stretching from one season to the next. When we think of food preservation, drying may seem humble compared to the drama of salt caravans or the scientific triumph of canning. Yet, in its quiet simplicity, it was perhaps the most universal, the most accessible, and the most enduring method. It required no empires, no mines, no complex technology, only the sun, the air, and human patience. And from that patience came security, tradition, and culture. As we move forward, from the open fields where food dried under the elements to the smoky chambers where flavor and preservation merged, we step into another chapter of human ingenuity. Let us now explore smoking, the preservation method that not only kept food safe, but also transformed it into something deeply flavorful and enduring. Where drying relied on the open sun and steady winds, smoking was the art of harnessing fire itself. At some point in prehistory, humans noticed that food exposed to smoke lasted longer, carried fewer insects, and tasted richer. What began as an accidental discovery, perhaps strips of meat hung too close to the fire inside a hut, soon evolved into one of the most important preservation techniques known across the world. Smoking was not only a way to keep food from spoiling, but it also transformed it into something new, something infused with flavor, aroma, and cultural meaning that reached far beyond survival. The preservation power of smoke lies in its chemistry. When wood burns, it releases compounds such as phenols, formaldehyde, and organic acids. These chemicals coat the surface of the food, creating a hostile environment for bacteria and mold, while also repelling insects. In addition, the gentle heat of smoking dries food further, working hand in hand with the preservative qualities of the smoke itself. The result is a dual effect flavor and safety. A side of fish that might rot within a day could, once smoked, last for weeks or even months. Meat cured and smoked became firm, salty, smoky, and resilient, a food that could sustain families, armies, and travelers far beyond the reach of the fire that first prepared it. Smoking also took advantage of the architecture of human living spaces. In many early homes, cooking fires were kept burning constantly in the center of huts or longhouses. Meat or fish hung from rafters or beams above these fires would naturally absorb smoke over time. What began as necessity soon became tradition, and eventually, deliberate smoking structures were built. In Northern Europe, smokehouses appeared small buildings where food could be hung and exposed to controlled fires. These smokehouses became as important to a village as granaries or mills, standing at the crossroads of survival and culture. Different regions developed their own styles of smoking, each shaped by climate, available resources, and culinary preference. In Scandinavia, cold smoking of fish like salmon produced foods that were light, delicate, and long-lasting. In North America, indigenous peoples smoked buffalo, venison, and fish, creating portable rations like pemmican, a mixture of smoked meat, fat, and berries that could sustain life for months. In Eastern Europe, smoked sausages became a staple, carried in packs or stored in cool rooms through winter. In Japan, bonito was smoked and dried into katsuobushi, an ingredient that remains essential to Japanese cuisine to this day. The universality of smoking reflects its effectiveness, but the regional variations tell stories of identity, environment, and culture. Smoking was also about taste. The woods chosen oak, hickory, alder, beech, apple, cherry each contributed unique flavors to the food. A fish smoked over alderwood in the Pacific Northwest carried different notes than one smoked over oak in England. Over time, people came to prize not only the longevity of smoked foods, but also the complexity of their flavors. What started as survival became culinary art. Even today, smoked foods are associated with richness and tradition. Smoked salmon, smoked cheeses, smoked paprika, all echoes of a practice born from necessity. The process of smoking food also carried social and communal aspects. In many villages, families worked together during the smoking season, often in autumn, when meat from slaughtered animals needed to be preserved for winter. The smokehouse filled with sides of pork, sausages, and fish, its walls blackened with decades of use. The air thickened with the scent of wood smoke, a smell that became intertwined with memory and identity. Children grew up associating that aroma with safety, warmth, and the knowledge that their family would not go hungry in the cold months to come. In this way, smoke was not just a preservative, it was a signal of security. Smoking also became deeply tied to rituals and celebrations. Smoked hams, for example, were often reserved for holidays or feasts, their long preservation making them suitable for marking special occasions. In Catholic Europe, smoked fish became associated with Lenten fasting traditions, providing protein when meat was forbidden. Among indigenous peoples, smoked foods often carried spiritual significance, the smoke itself linking the physical and spiritual worlds. In each case, smoking was not only about eating, but also about meaning, identity, and continuity. Yet, like all preservation methods, smoking had its limitations. It required time, labor, and access to specific woods. If not done properly, smoked food could still spoil, or worse, develop harmful toxins. The balance of heat, smoke, and airflow had to be carefully managed, knowledge passed down through generations. Families who failed to master the technique risked losing valuable food stores. Over time, specialized smoking traditions developed, and mastery of this skill became a point of pride, with each region and household claiming unique expertise. The durability of smoked foods made them invaluable for exploration and war. Sailors carried smoked fish and meats aboard ships, reducing the risk of scurvy and starvation during long voyages. Soldiers packed smoked sausages and hams into their gear, fueling campaigns across continents. Traders filled wagons with smoked goods, confident they could withstand long journeys without spoilage. These foods were not just provisions, they were enablers of expansion, tools that allowed humans to push into new lands, endure harsh seasons, and connect distant regions through trade. Even in the modern world, where refrigeration and industrial preservation dominate, smoking endures as both tradition and luxury. We still gather around barbecues and smokers, celebrating the alchemy of fire, wood, and food. We still prize the taste of smoked meats, fish, and cheeses, a sensory link to a past when survival depended on the same techniques. The persistence of smoking in our diets and cultures is a testament to its power, not only to preserve, but to transform. To picture the importance of smoking in earlier times, imagine a family in a medieval village. The slaughter of a pig in autumn was both a necessity and a community event. The family salted portions of meat and hung them in the smokehouse, where a slow, steady fire burned for days. As the meat darkened and hardened, its transformation promised survival through the long winter ahead. Every visit to the smokehouse carried the reassurance of food waiting patiently, transformed by smoke into something enduring. The aroma seeped into clothing, walls, and memory, becoming part of the fabric of life itself. Smoking, like drying and salting, was an ingenious response to a universal problem. It turned the unpredictable nature of food into something stable and trustworthy. It turned perishability into security. And perhaps most importantly, it turned necessity into flavor, a gift from fire and wood that nourished both body and culture. From the smoky chambers of preservation, we now turn to another method that relied not on fire, but on liquid transformation pickling, the ancient art of immersing food in vinegar or brine, creating sharp, tangy flavors that could last for months or years. If salting was about crystals and smoking was about fire, then pickling was about liquid transformation. To pickle food is to take something fragile and fleeting, cucumbers, cabbage, fish, eggs, and submerge it in a bath of vinegar or brine, turning it into something sharp, tangy, and lasting. This method of preservation combined chemistry and patience, and it gave rise to entire culinary traditions that survive into the modern world. From Korean kimchi to Eastern European sauerkraut, from pickled herring on northern coasts to jars of dill cucumbers in American kitchens, pickling has proven itself one of humanity's most enduring strategies against spoilage. At its core, pickling works in two different, but sometimes overlapping ways: vinegar pickling and brine fermentation. Vinegar, an acidic liquid often produced from wine or other fermented products, creates an environment too harsh for most bacteria to survive. Brine, a concentrated salt solution, works more slowly by encouraging certain beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus to thrive, while harmful microbes are pushed aside. Both methods preserve food by altering its environment, making it inhospitable to decay and extending its lifespan far beyond what nature intended. The story of vinegar itself is as ancient as civilization. Early winemakers must have noticed that neglected wine turned sour when exposed to air. Rather than discarding this sharp liquid, they found it had powerful preservative properties. Vinegar became more than just a culinary byproduct. It became a tool for survival. Ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians pickled vegetables and fish in vinegar, storing them for future use. The Greeks and Romans, too, relied on pickling, not only for preservation, but for flavor. Roman soldiers carried pickled vegetables as part of their rations, their tangy bite cutting through the monotony of salted meats and grain porridge. Vinegar was so important that it even became part of military logistics, ensuring armies could travel farther and last longer on limited supplies. Brine pickling, by contrast, was more mysterious in its effects, especially in times before people understood bacteria. Salt water alone slowed spoilage, but when vegetables were submerged in brine and left to sit, something remarkable happened. Natural microbes transformed the food, producing lactic acid that created both preservation and a unique tangy taste. This fermentation process turned cabbage into sauerkraut, cucumbers into traditional pickles, and a wide range of regional specialties into staples that nourished communities through long winters. Without refrigeration, these tangy, crunchy foods became reliable sources of vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which helped prevent diseases like scurvy among sailors and soldiers. Pickling was especially important in regions with harsh seasonal changes. In northern Europe, where fresh produce vanished during the cold months, sauerkraut became a lifeline. In Korea, kimchi fulfilled the same role, prepared in vast quantities before winter and buried underground in jars to ferment slowly, feeding families with its spicy, tangy richness until the next harvest. Each household had its own recipes, passed down through generations, blending preservation with culture and identity. What started as a necessity became tradition, a practice as much about community and heritage as about survival. Pickling also carried economic weight. In coastal areas, fish like herring were salted, brined, and packed into barrels, creating goods that could travel across seas. Pickled herring became a cornerstone of diets in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and Eastern Europe, fueling trade networks and sustaining populations far from the coast. In Asia, pickled fish and vegetables were traded between regions, their durability making them ideal commodities. Jars of pickled goods could last for months or years, surviving journeys that fresh foods could not endure. For merchants, pickling was profit. For families, it was security. The variety of foods that could be pickled seemed endless. Vegetables, fruits, meats, fish, eggs, even nuts found their way into brine or vinegar. In India, mangoes were pickled with spices, creating tangy accompaniments to meals. In Japan, pickled plums called umeboshi became famous for their sharp flavor and supposed medicinal properties. In the Middle East, olives were preserved in brine, becoming staples of daily diets and trade. Each culture adapted pickling to local ingredients, turning fragile harvests into preserved treasures that defined their cuisines. The sensory experience of pickling was also significant. The sharp bite of vinegar, the tang of lactic fermentation, the crunch of vegetables transformed by brine, all offered relief from the monotony of preserved grains or dried meats. In a world where much of the preserved food was dense, salty, or bland, pickles offered vibrancy. A meal of salted pork and stale bread could be enlivened by a sharp pickle on the side. The contrast made preservation not only about survival, but also about pleasure. Flavor, after all, is as much a part of nourishment as calories. Pickling also intersected with ritual and identity. In Jewish tradition, pickled cucumbers became iconic, accompanying meals and symbolizing continuity across centuries of migration and hardship. In Eastern Europe, communal sauerkraut making was a seasonal event where families gathered to shred mountains of cabbage, singing songs and sharing stories as they worked. In Korea, the making of kimchi, called kimyang, was so central to community life that UNESCO recognized it as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. These traditions show how a preservation method born of necessity became woven into the fabric of culture, identity, and belonging. For all its strengths, pickling had its challenges. Vinegar was not always easy to produce, requiring fermentation processes that were themselves fragile. Brine fermentation demanded careful attention, as spoilage could still occur if the balance of salt, temperature, or cleanliness was disrupted. A ruined batch meant not just disappointment, but potential hunger in the months ahead. Families learned to guard their recipes and methods carefully, refining them through experience. Success meant survival. Failure could be costly. Pickling also had health implications. Beyond providing vital vitamins, fermented pickles contributed beneficial bacteria to the gut, strengthening digestion and health, even if people at the time did not understand why. Vinegar itself was believed to have medicinal qualities, prescribed by physicians for ailments ranging from fevers to infections. Sailors carried barrels of sauerkraut, not just as food, but as medicine against scurvy, a practice that saved countless lives. In this way, pickling was both sustenance and healing, another example of how preservation methods shaped more than just diets. Imagine life in a pre-modern village as winter approached. The harvest had been gathered, but the fields would soon be barren. In the kitchen, jars filled with cucumbers, onions, cabbage, and other vegetables stood lined along shelves. their contents suspended in brine or vinegar. Each jar was a promise that even in the depths of February, when snow lay heavy and fresh food was a distant memory, there would still be something sharp, crunchy, and nourishing to eat. Each jar was also a reminder of labor, tradition, and the cleverness of ancestors who had found a way to wrestle permanence out of perishability. Even in the modern age, pickling persists. Supermarkets brim with jars of pickles, olives, sauerkraut, and kimchi. Food enthusiasts continue to experiment with brines and spices, reviving old traditions in new kitchens. The flavors of pickled foods remain beloved, not because they are necessary for survival, but because they connect us to deep cultural roots and offer pleasures that refrigeration alone cannot provide. Pickling endures because it is more than preservation. It is transformation, a way of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. From the sharp tang of pickling, we turn next to another transformation of food, one that also relies on unseen microbes and time. Fermentation, perhaps the most mysterious and magical of preservation methods, did not just save food, it created some of humanity's greatest culinary achievements, from wine and beer to cheese and bread. If drying and salting were about controlling nature, fermentation was about collaborating with it. Fermentation is one of humanity's oldest and most mysterious preservation methods, discovered not through deliberate invention, but through observation and acceptance of change. Left on its own, food transforms. Grapes turn to wine, milk curdles into cheese, cabbage ferments into sauerkraut, and barley becomes beer. Where untrained eyes might see spoilage, generations of humans recognized opportunity. Fermentation harnessed the unseen work of microbes long before anyone knew bacteria and yeast existed, transforming fragile foods into products that not only lasted longer, but often became richer, more complex, and more nourishing than the originals. At its essence, fermentation is controlled decay. Microorganisms, yeasts, molds, and bacteria consume sugars and starches, producing acids, alcohols, or gases. These byproducts create an environment unfriendly to harmful microbes, stabilizing food while also changing its flavor, texture, and aroma. This process gave humanity not just preservation, but some of its most beloved staples: bread, cheese, beer, wine, yogurt, and countless regional specialties. What began as survival strategies became cultural cornerstones, shaping economies, rituals, and identities. Consider wine. Somewhere in the distant past, early humans noticed that fruit left unattended in containers sometimes produced a bubbling, intoxicating liquid. Instead of discarding it, they experimented, eventually learning to encourage the process by crushing grapes and storing the juice. The result was wine, a beverage that not only lasted far longer than fresh fruit juice, but also carried social, religious, and medicinal significance. Wine was central to Greek symposiums, Roman feasts, and Christian rituals. Its durability allowed it to be stored, transported, and traded, spreading vineyards and viticulture across continents. Preservation and pleasure fused in the cup. Beer followed a similar path. Grains, once soaked and left to sit, began to ferment, producing a drink that was safer to consume than untreated water and more stable than porridge. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, beer was so important it was offered to gods and used to pay workers. The fermentation process not only extended the life of grain, but also provided calories and nutrients in liquid form, a vital supplement to diets in regions where bread and beer became daily staples. Fermented drinks became both sustenance and celebration, testaments to the ingenuity of people who learned to harness microscopic allies without ever seeing them. Fermentation's genius lay in its adaptability. Almost every culture, in every climate, developed its own fermented foods, each reflecting local resources. In Northern Europe, cabbage fermented into sauerkraut provided vitamins that staved off scurvy in long winters. In Korea, kimchi combined cabbage, garlic, chili, and brine into a spicy, tangy dish that sustained families through cold months. In the Middle East, yogurt preserved milk in warm climates where it would otherwise spoil within hours. In West Africa, locust beans fermented into airu, a pungent seasoning essential to local cuisines. In Japan, soybeans became miso and soy sauce, staples that defined the flavor of the entire region's diet. These foods were not only practical, they were identity, memory, and tradition preserved in jars, crocks, and casks. Milk, one of the most perishable foods, benefited especially from fermentation. Fresh milk sours quickly, but fermentation transforms it into products that can last far longer. Yogurt, kefir, and buttermilk extended milk's usefulness while adding probiotics that strengthened health, even if ancient people had no concept of microbiology. Cheese, in particular, represented a miracle of preservation. By curdling milk and allowing it to age, people created solid, long-lasting food that could be stored, transported, and traded. Cheese became a cornerstone of diets in Europe and the Middle East, with each region developing its own varieties, from the crumbly feta of Greece to the aged cheddars of England. A single preservation technique gave birth to thousands of distinct traditions. Fermentation also offered safety. Before modern sanitation, drinking water could be risky, contaminated with bacteria that caused illness. Fermented beverages like beer, wine, and cider provided safer alternatives, as the acids and alcohol they contained killed or inhibited dangerous microbes. In many societies, these drinks were consumed daily, not as luxuries, but as necessities. Children in medieval Europe often drank low-alcohol small beer because it was safer than water. In this way, fermentation literally sustained life, offering security against invisible threats long before germ theory explained why. The cultural and spiritual roles of fermentation cannot be overstated. Fermented foods and drinks were often central to rituals, festivals, and beliefs. Wine was sacred in Dionysian rites, symbolic in Christian communion, and central to countless celebrations. Beer had its own gods in Mesopotamian religion, with Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, honored in hymns that doubled as brewing instructions. Fermented foods like kimchi, miso, or sourdough bread became not just sustenance but cultural emblems, linking communities through shared practices and tastes. Fermentation turned survival into art and necessity into meaning. Economically, fermentation fueled trade and wealth. Wine and beer industries supported entire economies, employing farmers, brewers, merchants, and tavern keepers. Cheese became a trade commodity, carried across regions and stored in monasteries that perfected its production. Soy sauce traveled across Asia in jars, its long shelf life making it an ideal trade item. Fermented fish sauces, like garum in ancient Rome, were so valued that their factories became industrial-scale enterprises. Fermentation was not a small household trick. It was a driver of economies, empires, and commerce. Yet fermentation required skill and patience. It was not as simple as drying food in the sun. Temperatures, timing, containers, and ingredients all influenced the outcome. A failed batch of beer could turn sour and undrinkable. Cheese could rot instead of age. Sauerkraut could mold if not packed correctly. The unpredictability of fermentation made it both magical and dangerous. Knowledge of the craft was guarded and passed down carefully, a blend of science, art, and ritual. In monasteries, brewers and cheesemakers became custodians of this knowledge, perfecting recipes that continue to this day. Imagine for a moment life in a medieval village. Fresh milk from the cow would sour by evening if left alone. But by turning it into cheese, a family could store nourishment for months, trading extra wheels with neighbors or saving them for winter. A cabbage harvested in autumn could be chopped, salted, and pressed into barrels, transforming over weeks into sauerkraut that would feed the family through cold months. Beer brewed in the autumn would fill cellars, ready to provide safe drink when streams froze or became contaminated. Fermentation was not just clever, it was the backbone of survival, woven seamlessly into daily rhythms. The legacy of fermentation endures powerfully in the modern world. We may not depend on it for survival in the same way, but our diets would be unimaginable without it. Wine, beer, cheese, bread, yogurt, soy sauce, kimchi all remain beloved, central to cuisines across the globe. Modern science has revealed the microbial mysteries behind the process, but the wonder remains. We still marvel at how invisible organisms can turn milk into tangy yogurt or grapes into complex wines. The survival technique of our ancestors has become our pleasure, our tradition, and our art. From the bubbling jars of fermentation, let us move into another preservation strategy that relied less on transformation and more on temperature and environment. In the next chapter, we will explore the ingenious use of ice houses, caves, and cold storage methods that harness nature's chill long before mechanical refrigeration existed. When we think about refrigeration today, we imagine sleek machines powered by electricity, humming quietly in our kitchens, keeping food fresh at the turn of a dial. But for thousands of years before the refrigerator was invented, people looked to nature itself to find cold spaces where food could be preserved. Long before machinery, humans discovered that caves, cellars, and carefully constructed ice houses could extend the life of food by weeks or even months. Cold storage was one of the earliest methods that allowed communities to plan ahead, to save abundance for leaner times, and to trust that their hard work in harvest or hunt would not vanish into spoilage overnight. The principle was simple. Low temperatures slow down the growth of bacteria and fungi, keeping food edible for longer. Even without understanding the science, ancient peoples could see the results. A slab of meat left in the summer sun spoiled within a day, but the same meat stored in a cool cave might last far longer. Water drawn from underground springs was colder than that left in open air, and milk placed in clay jars and shaded cellars soured more slowly than milk left above ground. These observations became the basis of cold storage, a practice that bridged the gap between raw abundance and survival. Caves were among the first natural refrigerators. In limestone regions of Europe, caves maintained stable, cool temperatures throughout the year. Families used them to store cheese, wine, and grains, finding that the constant chill and humidity created ideal conditions. Some of the world's most famous cheeses, like Roquefort, were discovered by accident in such caves, where natural molds thrived. In the Middle East, where summer heat could be unbearable, underground storage rooms carved into rock preserved dates, nuts, and even ice brought down from mountains. In Asia, too, caves were used to store foods ranging from pickled vegetables to tea, creating traditions that lasted for centuries. But caves were not always available, and so people learned to mimic them. Root cellars dug beneath houses or barns became common in Europe and North America. These cool, dark spaces allowed families to store potatoes, carrots, turnips, and cabbages through winter. Shelves were lined with jars of preserves, barrels of apples, and sacks of onions, each item carefully placed so that the chill and stillness of the earth could keep them from spoiling. A well-stocked cellar was not just a storage place, it was a sign of foresight and security. Families who invested time in their cellars could weather long winters with confidence, while those who did not risked hunger. The use of ice itself became a more ambitious project. As far back as 2000 BCE, wealthy families in China and Mesopotamia harvested ice from mountains or rivers in winter and stored it in pits insulated with straw or sawdust. These primitive ice houses kept ice for months, allowing the privileged few to cool drinks and preserve foods even in summer. In Persia, a unique structure called a yakshala massive dome of mud brick was built to store ice and food in desert climates. These structures, designed with thick walls and underground chambers, could maintain surprisingly low temperatures in scorching heat. They stand as testaments to the ingenuity of ancient engineers who harnessed nature as cold, even in the hottest environments. In Europe, the tradition of ice houses became widespread among aristocrats in the 17th and 18th centuries. Wealthy estates featured elegant brick or stone ice houses, often hidden in gardens or near lakes. Servants cut blocks of ice from frozen rivers during winter, hauling them into these insulated chambers where they were packed tightly with straw. The ice lasted through summer, keeping meat, butter, and cream fresh for months. For the upper classes, cold storage became a symbol of luxury and refinement, associated not just with survival, but with indulgence-iced desserts, chilled wines, and lavish summer feasts that displayed wealth as much as taste. Communities, too, benefited from shared ice storage. In some towns, public ice pits or cellars were maintained for collective use, ensuring that even those without private facilities could preserve food. Markets relied on cold storage to keep fish and meat fresh for trade, while inns and taverns used it to provide travelers with meals that were safer and more appealing. The ability to store food in cold conditions extended not just the life of food, but also the reach of commerce, allowing markets to flourish further from sources of fresh produce or catch. Cold storage was not without its challenges. Collecting ice was dangerous, requiring laborers to work on frozen rivers with heavy tools. A warm winter could reduce the harvest, leading to shortages in the summer months ahead. Maintaining ice houses demanded constant vigilance, keeping doors sealed, insulation intact, and pests at bay. For those relying on caves or cellars, dampness could cause mold, and poor ventilation could ruin entire stores. Yet despite these risks, the rewards were worth it. Cold storage provided a sense of control over time, a way of bending the seasons to human needs. For ordinary people, root cellars were especially vital. Picture a farming family in early America. After harvest, the family gathered potatoes, carrots, apples, and jars of pickled vegetables, carefully placing them in the cellar beneath their home. All winter long, they would descend into the cool, earthy air, lantern in hand, to retrieve what they needed for meals. The cellar was more than storage. It was a lifeline, the silent partner in their struggle against hunger. Every successful winter meant that the system had worked, that the cold earth had guarded their food faithfully until spring. The social symbolism of cold storage was also powerful. In many cultures, ice and chilled foods became associated with status. To offer a guest a cold drink in summer was to demonstrate wealth and sophistication. In China, ice was a luxury reserved for emperors and the elite. In Europe, chilled desserts and sorbets dazzled banquet halls. What began as preservation for survival became a marker of privilege, a division between those who could command ice and those who could not. The coolness of stored food carried not only physical refreshment, but also social meaning. The use of natural cold storage reached its peak in the 19th century, when the global ice trade emerged. Entrepreneurs in New England cut massive quantities of ice from frozen lakes and shipped it as far as India and the Caribbean, packed in sawdust and loaded into insulated ships. Ice became a global commodity, linking distant economies and expanding the possibilities of preservation. Though mechanical refrigeration would eventually eclipse it, the ice trade demonstrated the extraordinary lengths people would go to control cold. The simple principle discovered in caves and cellars had scaled into an international enterprise. Even today, echoes of these practices remain. Root cellars are still used in rural areas, prized for their simplicity and sustainability. Cheese caves continue to produce some of the world's most beloved cheeses. Wineries still depend on underground storage to age their products in stable conditions. And though our refrigerators make cold storage effortless, the tradition of using the Earth's coolness connects us to the ingenuity of our ancestors, who made survival possible without the machines we now take for granted. Cold storage in caves, cellars, and ice houses represents humanity's enduring relationship with the natural world. It shows how observation, adaptation, and labor transformed fleeting abundance into lasting sustenance. It reminds us that the refrigerator in our kitchen is not a sudden miracle, but the latest chapter in a story thousands of years old, written in stone walls, underground chambers, and blocks of harvested ice. From the chill of cellars and ice houses, we now turn to the granaries and silos of the ancient world structures that protected the most vital food of all, grain, the foundation of civilizations, and one of the earliest staples to be stored against time. If meat, fish, and vegetables could be preserved with salt, smoke, or brine, it was grain that posed the greatest challenge and carried the greatest importance. Grain was the heartbeat of ancient societies, the foundation upon which civilizations rose. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, and millet provided the calories that sustained millions, but they were also vulnerable. Moisture, pests, and mold could turn a precious harvest into waste within weeks. To safeguard grain was to safeguard life itself. And so some of humanity's earliest architectural and technological innovations were devoted to building pits, silos, and granaries capable of defending the harvest from the slow but relentless march of decay. The problem with grain was deceptively simple. It had to be kept dry, protected from animals, and shielded from temperature extremes. Left in the open, harvested grain would quickly absorb moisture from rain or air, sprouting or rotting. Rodents and insects would swarm to the easy feast, spoiling far more than they consumed. For early farmers, the loss of stored grain could mean famine. The solution required ingenuity structures built not for beauty, but for survival, each designed to outwit nature and time. One of the oldest methods was the grain pit. In prehistoric Europe and Africa, people dug deep holes into the earth, often lined with clay, straw, or stone, and filled them with harvested grain. Once sealed, the pits created airtight conditions, slowing spoilage and keeping pests at bay. Archaeologists have discovered ancient grain pits containing seeds thousands of years old, still intact enough to be identified. While the grain was often no longer edible, its survival speaks to the effectiveness of these primitive silos. Families and communities relied on them as their hidden vaults, sometimes camouflaged to protect against thieves as well as animals. Over time, granaries evolved into above-ground structures. In Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of agriculture, vast granaries stored surplus barley and wheat, allowing city-states to feed large populations and armies. These granaries were often communal, controlled by temples or governments, making grain not just food, but a currency of power. Taxes were collected in grain, wages paid in grain, and armies sustained by grain. To control the granaries was to control the lifeblood of society. Records from Sumerian clay tablets reveal careful tallies of grain deposits and withdrawals, evidence of an economy built upon preservation and storage. In Egypt, where the Nile's floods provided rich harvests, granaries were essential for bridging the years when crops failed. Pharaohs built massive storage complexes, some with vaulted ceilings and thick walls, designed to keep the interior cool and dry. Grain was poured in from the top and removed from the bottom, an ingenious system that minimized spoilage and allowed fresh harvests to cycle efficiently. Joseph's biblical interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, underscores how grain storage was tied, not only to survival, but also to myth and faith. Different regions developed unique adaptations. In sub-Saharan Africa, raised granaries built on stilts kept grain away from damp soil and rodents. In India, underground silos lined with mud or stone were common, while in China, elaborate wooden granaries with sloped roofs became standard. The Inca of South America built colchas stone storage buildings high in the Andes, where cold mountain air kept maize and potatoes fresh for years. These structures supported not only local villages, but entire empires, enabling the Inca to maintain food supplies for armies and for redistribution to conquered peoples. Each culture, facing its own environment, found architectural solutions to the universal challenge of keeping grain edible. The threat of pests was constant. Mice, rats, and insects could infiltrate even the most carefully designed storage. To combat this, people developed ingenious methods of sealing, fumigating, and guarding granaries. Cats were welcomed into Egyptian and Roman granaries to hunt rodents, becoming so valued that they took on sacred status. In some cultures, herbs and ashes were mixed with stored grain to deter insects. Fires were lit near storage pits to dry the air, while smoke sometimes served as a deterrent. The war between human hunger and the appetites of pests was fought daily in the shadows of these silos and pits. The importance of stored grain extended beyond survival into politics and warfare. Armies could not march without steady supplies, and cities under siege relied on their granaries to hold out. Ancient military strategy often involved destroying or seizing enemy grain stores, knowing that to starve a people was to conquer them. Grain surpluses also fueled trade, as communities with abundant storage could export to neighbors, exchanging food for metals, textiles, or luxury goods. In this way, storage was not just about feeding a village, it was about connecting entire regions, shaping economies that stretched far beyond the fields where the grain was grown. Grain also had symbolic power. In many cultures, grain represented fertility, abundance, and divine blessing. To fill a silo was to invite prosperity. To see it empty was to fear divine displeasure. Rituals often accompanied the filling of pits or the sealing of granaries, with prayers or offerings made to gods or spirits who were believed to guard the harvest. These ceremonies underscore how central grain preservation was to the rhythm of life, linking the spiritual world to the very practical problem of spoilage. Imagine a farming family in ancient Europe at the end of harvest. They worked for weeks, cutting, threshing, and winnowing their grain. With care, they carried sacks to a pit dug in the earth, lined with straw and sealed with clay. As the final cover was pressed into place, the family breathed relief, knowing their labor would sustain them through winter. For months, they would live on bread and porridge, each meal drawn from the invisible treasure hidden below the ground. The pit was not only storage, it was survival embodied in earth and seed. In medieval Europe, granaries became communal symbols of wealth and security. Monasteries often held vast stores of grain, feeding not only monks, but also peasants in times of scarcity. Castles featured fortified granaries, guarded as fiercely as the armories, because food was as essential to defense as weapons. Towns built large storehouses where grain could be sold or distributed, ensuring steady supply in markets. The rhythms of urban life, bread baked each morning, ale brewed each week, were made possible by the silent, steady presence of stored grain. Even into the modern era, before refrigeration transformed diets, grain storage remained central. In rural America, families relied on wooden silos to hold corn or wheat, while governments built massive grain elevators to manage surplus and stabilize markets. Wars in the 20th century still targeted grain supplies, with blockades and bombings aimed at crippling food chains. The struggle to store and protect grain remained a fundamental part of human conflict and cooperation alike. Grain storage also shaped population growth. The ability to preserve large quantities meant that societies could support larger cities, more soldiers, and more specialized labor. Without reliable grain stores, urban life would collapse, as fresh harvests could never sustain dense populations alone. In this way, pits and silos were as important to civilization as aqueducts or roads. They were silent engines of progress, ensuring that the energy captured by fields could be carried forward through time. Today, modern silos stand tall on skylines of rural landscapes, made of steel and concrete, storing grain by the thousands of tons. Yet their principle remains unchanged from the ancient pits dug by early farmers. Keep grain dry, keep it safe, and you preserve not only food, but also the continuity of communities. The hum of machines may replace the sealing of clay, but the story is the same. Human beings, forever fighting the fragility of their harvests, forever seeking to hold on to abundance. From the silent vaults of grain pits and towering silos, we move next to another form of preservation that relied not on earth or stone, but on sweetness itself. In the following chapter, we will explore how honey and sugar became not only luxuries, but also powerful tools for preserving fruits, meats, and medicines, sweetening survival as much as taste. Among the many tools humanity developed to fight spoilage, few are as sweet literally as honey and sugar. Long before refrigeration, people discovered that sweetness could act as a powerful preservative. Honey, in particular, was revered not only as food, but also as medicine and even as a sacred substance. Later, when sugar spread across the world, it became both a luxury and a preservative, transforming fragile fruits into lasting treasures. Together, honey and sugar illustrate how preservation was not just about survival, but also about indulgence, wealth, and the pleasures of taste. Honey is perhaps the oldest natural preservative known to humankind. Archaeologists have discovered sealed pots of honey in Egyptian tombs, thousands of years old, still edible. Its longevity lies in its composition. Honey is made of concentrated sugars that draw water out of bacteria and molds through osmosis, preventing them from growing. Its natural acidity and small amounts of hydrogen peroxide also create an environment hostile to microbes. The result is that honey, properly sealed, can last almost indefinitely. Ancient peoples may not have known the chemistry, but they understood the results. Honey could be trusted when other foods failed. Beyond its preservation powers, honey was a luxury. Beekeeping was practiced by the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, who prized honey for sweetening foods and for medicinal purposes. Honey was used to coat fruits and nuts, protecting them from the air and extending their shelf life. In some cultures, meats were even cooked and stored in honey, both preserving them and creating unique flavors. Honey's golden glow and unspoiled nature made it a symbol of purity and abundance, celebrated in myths and rituals. To taste honey was to taste wealth, health, and survival. Sugar, by contrast, came later to much of the world, but had an equally transformative effect. Derived originally from sugarcane in South and Southeast Asia, sugar spread slowly through trade routes, reaching the Middle East and then Europe by the Middle Ages. At first, it was so rare and expensive that it was treated as a spice, sold in tiny amounts alongside cinnamon and pepper. By the early modern period, as plantations expanded and colonial empires grew, sugar became more widely available, though still a marker of wealth. Its preservation powers quickly made it indispensable in the kitchens of the wealthy. The principle of sugar preservation is similar to honey's. By creating a highly concentrated environment of dissolved sugar, water activity is reduced, leaving microbes unable to thrive. Fruits submerged in sugar syrup or rolled in sugar crystals could last far beyond their natural lifespan. Jams, jellies, candied fruits, and marmalades all emerged from this discovery, allowing fragile harvests of strawberries, apricots, or oranges to be enjoyed months or even years later. What began as a preservation method became a culinary art, shaping desserts and traditions that persist today. One of the most famous examples of sugar preservation is marmalade. In the 16th century, Portuguese traders brought bitter Seville oranges to Europe. By cooking the fruit with sugar, people discovered a way to transform its sharpness into a rich preserve that could last through winter. In Britain, marmalade became a staple, enjoyed not only for its taste, but also for its ability to provide vitamin C, warding off scurvy in sailors. The marriage of fruit and sugar was more than delicious. It was life-saving. Candied fruits were another revelation. By boiling fruits in thick sugar syrups, cooks created confections that sparkled like jewels, prized in medieval and Renaissance courts. These treats were not merely food, but status symbols, reserved for the wealthy who could afford both fruit and sugar. Banquets featured elaborate displays of candied cherries, pears, or ginger, presented as much for their beauty as their flavor. In this way, preservation through sugar was tied directly to power and prestige, marking the divide between those who could indulge and those who could not. But sugar was not only about luxury. It also played a role in long-distance trade and exploration. Preserved fruits and jams were packed onto ships, providing sailors with valuable nutrients during voyages. In colonial times, sugar production itself became a global force, driving economies and, tragically, fueling the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil were built on the labor of enslaved people, their suffering hidden behind the sweetness that reached European tables. In this sense, sugar's history as a preservative is inseparable from the broader history of exploitation and empire. Honey, by contrast, remained more localized and tied to ancient traditions. In many cultures, honey was seen as medicinal, used to treat wounds, soothe throats, and preserve herbs or roots. Mixtures of honey and spices were stored as tonics, lasting for years. Honey also preserved cultural memory. In Greece, it was offered to gods and the dead. In Jewish tradition, honey symbolized hope and abundance, eaten at Rosh Hashanah to welcome a sweet new year. In each case, honey was more than practical. It was sacred, its preservative qualities reflecting divine power. The everyday uses of sugar and honey in households were equally vital. Families in Europe and the Middle East stored fruits in honey or syrup to extend their availability. During winter, when fresh produce was scarce, a spoonful of preserved fruit was both nourishment and comfort. The ability to offer sweetness in lean months made life not only bearable but joyful. Children grew up associating the taste of preserved fruits with celebration, memory, and security, ensuring that these practices were passed down through generations. Imagine life in a medieval European household. The harvest has brought apples, plums, and berries, far more than the family can eat before they spoil. Some are dried, others salted or pickled, but the most prized are preserved in sugar. Pots bubble over the fire, filling the house with the scent of boiling fruit. Jars are carefully filled and sealed with wax, stored away for winter. Months later, on a cold, gray day, the family gathers for a meal. Alongside salted meats and coarse bread, a spoonful of preserved berries is brought out, a burst of sweetness that recalls the warmth of summer. This was the true power of sugar and honey, not only to save food, but to carry memory and pleasure across time. Today, sugar and honey remain central to our diets, though often in ways that disguise their original purpose. We still eat jams, jellies, candied fruits, and honey-drizzled dishes, enjoying them as treats rather than necessities. Yet their roots lie in survival. Every spoonful of jam is a reminder that once, without such methods, the bounty of summer would have been lost by autumn. Every drop of honey is proof of a preservation method, so effective that it could outlast empires. These sweet tools remind us that human ingenuity is not only practical, but also capable of transforming necessity into delight. From the golden glow of honey and the crystalline sweetness of sugar, we now turn to preservation methods that relied less on sweetness and more on fat. In the next chapter, we will explore how oils, fats, and the technique of confit were used to seal foods from air, creating rich, savory stores that could last through the hungriest months of the year. If honey and sugar preserved food by sweetness, oils and fats did so by creating barriers. One of the simplest but most ingenious preservation methods involved sealing food away from air. Microbes and molds cannot thrive without oxygen, and by surrounding food with fat or submerging it in oil, people found they could hold decay at bay. What began as a practical solution in ancient kitchens became an entire culinary tradition, producing some of the richest and most flavorful dishes still enjoyed today. From jars of olives stored under olive oil in the Mediterranean to duck legs simmered slowly into confit in France, preservation with fat was both survival strategy and gastronomic art. The principle is straightforward. If food is cooked, dried, or salted, and then packed beneath a layer of fat or oil, the absence of air dramatically slows spoilage. The fat forms a natural seal, keeping moisture in and bacteria out. This technique could be applied to meats, vegetables, and even dairy products. In places where oil was plentiful, such as the olive-growing regions around the Mediterranean, households submerged cheeses, herbs, and vegetables in olive oil, preserving them for months while infusing them with flavor. Where animal fat was more common, as in Northern Europe, pork fat or suet was rendered and poured over cooked meats to lock them safely away until needed. One of the most famous examples of this technique is confit, a French method of preserving meat by cooking it slowly in its own fat, then storing it submerged in that fat. Duck or goose legs, salted and gently cooked, were packed into earthenware jars where the fat hardened into a protective layer. In the cold months that followed, the meat could be reheated and eaten, tasting as rich as the day it was made. Confit was both practical and delicious, turning necessity into delicacy. It sustained rural families and became a hallmark of French cuisine, its roots in preservation visible even in the finest restaurants today. In the Mediterranean, olive oil was the great preserver. Beyond its use in cooking and lighting, it became a liquid vault for vegetables, fish, and cheeses. Sun-dried tomatoes stored under olive oil developed a deep, tangy richness, while blocks of feta or other soft cheeses submerged in oil kept their freshness far longer than they would in open air. Herbs placed in oil flavored the fat, even as the oil protected them. These jars lined the shelves of kitchens from ancient Greece to Renaissance Italy, serving both as storage and as culinary treasure chests, where each preserved item carried the taste of the season into the future. Meats were often preserved with rendered animal fat in colder regions where olive oil was scarce. Pork was particularly useful, as lard could be produced in abundance and used as both cooking medium and preservative. Rillettes, a spreadable meat preserved in pork fat, originated as a way to extend the life of pork while creating a savory staple for the winter months. Hunters, too, relied on fat preservation, storing venison or other game in jars sealed with tallow. These foods were dense, hearty, and calorie-rich perfect sustenance for enduring cold seasons or long journeys. Fat and oil preservation was not limited to Europe and the Mediterranean. In the Middle East, foods like labneh, a strained yogurt cheese, were rolled into balls and stored in olive oil, providing nourishment and protein throughout the year. In parts of Africa, spiced butters were used to preserve meat, adding both flavor and longevity. In India, ghee, a clarified butter, became both a staple cooking fat and a means of storing food safely. Each culture adapted the technique to its resources, discovering that fat was not only a source of energy, but also a shield against spoilage. These methods had practical advantages beyond preservation. Foods stored in oil or fat were portable, easily carried on journeys or into battle. Soldiers and travelers could rely on jars of meat sealed with fat, confident that they would last without spoiling. For seafaring peoples, oil-preserved foods endured voyages, feeding crews far from home. The technique also supported trade, as preserved foods could be transported further and stored longer than fresh ones. In this way, oil and fat preservation expanded the reach of communities, linking regions through exchange. Yet preservation with fat was not without challenges. Rancidity, caused by fats breaking down over time, could spoil food if storage conditions were poor. Heat, light, or contamination could ruin a carefully prepared batch. Families learned to store jars in cool, dark places and to watch carefully for signs of spoilage. Despite these risks, the rewards were great. Nourishment secured against the unpredictability of seasons, a buffer against famine, and flavors that grew richer with time. The cultural significance of fat-preserved foods was also profound. In France, confit became more than a method. It became tradition, celebrated in recipes and rituals passed down through generations. In the Mediterranean, the practice of preserving foods in olive oil contributed to the famed Mediterranean diet, shaping tastes that endure to this day. Even in religious contexts, fat and oil preservation had symbolic weight. Olive oil, used for anointing and spiritual rituals, was also the guardian of sustenance in everyday life. The line between sacred and practical blurred, with preservation at its heart. Imagine for a moment a rural French household in the 17th century. After slaughtering a goose in autumn, the family salts the meat and cooks it slowly in its own fat. Once cooled, the meat is packed into jars, covered with the rendered fat, and stored in a cellar. Weeks later, when the snow has fallen and the fields lie barren, the jar is opened. The rich aroma of preserved goose fills the room, a promise of warmth and nourishment. What might have been fleeting abundance has been stretched across time, carried by the protective power of fat. Even in our modern world, echoes of these methods remain. Jars of sun-dried tomatoes and olive oil still appear in pantries, as do cheeses preserved in oil and roulettes preserved in fat. Restaurants celebrate confit as a delicacy, though its origins lie in the humble need to make meat last. The endurance of these foods in our diets is proof that preservation was never only about survival. It was also about flavor, richness, and the human ability to turn necessity into artistry. Preserving with oil and fat shows us another dimension of the ancient struggle against spoilage. Where salt-dried food and honey sweetened it, fat enveloped it, shielding it from the air that carried decay. It was a method that spoke to resourcefulness, to the careful use of every part of an animal or harvest, and to the joy of discovering that survival could taste luxurious. From the richness of fat and oil, we now move to another preservative with a very different effect: alcohol. In the next chapter, we will explore how wine, spirits, and strong brews not only preserved fruits and herbs, but also became cultural and social cornerstones, linking survival with celebration. Among all the strange allies humanity discovered in the war against spoilage, alcohol was perhaps the most surprising. It began as a byproduct of fermentation, the natural result of yeast feeding on sugars in fruit or grain. But what people quickly realized was that alcohol was not just intoxicating, it was protective. Alcoholic liquids like wine, beer, and spirits created environments too harsh for many bacteria to survive. As a result, foods and medicines steeped in alcohol lasted longer than they would have otherwise, and entire traditions of preservation grew around this discovery. What began as a way to keep food safe became entwined with ritual, medicine, and pleasure, reminding us that preservation was always about more than survival. The principle is simple. Alcohol is antimicrobial. Once its concentration rises above a certain level, it slows or halts the growth of dangerous microbes, extending the life of whatever it touches. This meant that fruits left to soak in brandy could be enjoyed months later. Herbs infused in wine retained their properties. And meat or fish packed with alcohol endured longer than if stored fresh. The double benefit was clear. Not only did alcohol preserve food, but it also transformed its flavor, adding richness and complexity. What might have been a fragile peach or cherry could become a luxurious delicacy once steeped in spirits. One of the oldest practices was the use of wine. In ancient Greece and Rome, fruits were often preserved by immersing them in wine or must, the unfermented juice of grapes. This not only protected the fruit, but also created sweet, intoxicating treats. In the Middle Ages, monasteries continued this tradition, producing wines and liqueurs infused with herbs, fruits, and spices. These concoctions were prized not just for their taste, but for their supposed medicinal qualities. To drink a cordial was to consume preservation and healing in the same sip. As distillation techniques spread in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, stronger spirits like brandy, rum, and whiskey became even more powerful preservatives. Their higher alcohol content provided longer-lasting protection, and their richness created entirely new categories of preserved foods. Cherries in brandy, pears in eau de vie, and plums in rum became luxuries enjoyed at feasts and in royal courts. These preserved fruits symbolized wealth and refinement, for only the privileged could afford both the fruit and the expensive spirits required. To present a guest with a jar of cherries in brandy was to display not only generosity, but also status. Alcohol was not limited to fruit preservation. In coastal Europe, fish was sometimes soaked in wine or spirits as a preservative. In parts of Eastern Europe, meat was marinated in alcohol and spices before storage, the combination slowing decay while infusing the food with bold flavors. Alcohol also became a solvent for herbs, roots, and spices, extracting flavors and properties that lasted long after the fresh ingredients would have spoiled. Apothecaries used alcohol to create tinctures, medicines that endured for years and could be carried easily, ready for use when illness struck. In this way, alcohol preserved not only food, but also knowledge and healing. The cultural role of alcohol-preserved foods was immense. In festive seasons across Europe, preserved fruits and liqueurs became staples of holiday tables. A cake studded with rum-soaked raisins or brandy-soaked currants was more than dessert. It was a symbol of abundance stretched across time. In monasteries, cordials infused with herbs were consumed both as medicine and as comfort. Sailors carried rum not only for drinking, but for preserving food and morale on long voyages. Alcohol preservation blurred the line between necessity and indulgence, becoming part of the rhythm of life. There were also practical advantages for long-distance trade. Alcohol-preserved goods could travel without spoiling, allowing merchants to move luxuries across continents. A jar of fruit preserved in brandy might travel from southern orchards to northern courts, arriving not as mush, but as a treasured delicacy. The sugar and spice trade of the early modern world often intersected with alcohol preservation, as fruits were cooked in syrups and fortified with spirits, creating goods that lasted through weeks at sea. The combination of sugar and alcohol made for nearly immortal foods, enjoyed far from the lands where they were first harvested. Alcohol's preservative powers were also connected to health, even if ancient theories misunderstood the reasons. For centuries, wine was considered safer to drink than water, especially in urban centers where wells were easily contaminated. Cordials and tinctures were prescribed for everything from stomach ailments to fevers, their alcoholic base ensuring they remained potent. Sailors used grog, a mixture of rum and water, to keep supplies safe on long voyages. In each case, alcohol stood at the intersection of preservation and protection, an invisible barrier against both spoilage and sickness. The rituals around alcohol-preserved foods often carried deep meaning. In some European households, cherries or plums were placed in brandy at harvest and only consumed at Christmas, the months-long wait becoming part of the tradition. In others, families made special liqueurs in autumn, storing them away for weddings, baptisms, or feasts. These foods were not just nourishment, they were time capsules, memories of summer carried into the depths of winter. To eat a preserved cherry was to taste the past, to bridge the gap between seasons through the work of alcohol. Imagine a 17th century French family preparing for winter. Alongside salted meats and dried vegetables, they fill jars with pears and cherries, submerging them in the brandy distilled nearby. As the months grow colder, these jars sit on cellar shelves, glowing faintly in the lamplight. When Christmas arrives, the jars are opened. The fruit, darkened and rich, releases the scent of spirits and summer orchards. Each bite is not only nourishment but memory, a reminder of sunshine in the bleakness of December. Alcohol has preserved not only food, but joy itself. Even today, alcohol preservation remains part of our culinary world. Christmas cakes are soaked in brandy, fruit preserved in rum is sold as delicacy, and cordials infused with herbs remain beloved traditions. Beyond the kitchen, alcohol continues to serve as a preservative in medicines and extracts, its stability ensuring that flavors and properties endure. Though refrigeration has made its practical role less necessary, the flavors of alcohol-preserved foods still carry the weight of centuries, linking us to the ingenuity of our ancestors. Alcohol, as a preserver, tells us something profound about human culture. It shows how necessity and pleasure are never far apart. What began as a way to keep food safe became a way to create delicacies, medicines, and traditions. Alcohol preserved not only nourishment but identity, weaving itself into the stories of families, festivals, and empires. In its amber depths and ruby jars, we glimpse not just survival but celebration. From the intoxicating embrace of alcohol, we move to another preservative that has long captured human imagination: spices. Were spices truly preserving food, or were they masking the taste of decay? In the next chapter, we will explore the myths, realities, and global consequences of spices in the history of preservation. Few substances in history have inspired as much fascination, desire, and myth as spices. For centuries, cloves, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and countless others were treasured as rare treasures, traded along dangerous routes that spanned continents. They flavored foods, they filled apothecaries, and they commanded prices higher than gold. But beyond taste and status, spices were long believed to preserve food. Their pungent aromas and sharp flavors gave the impression of power. And for generations, people thought that a sprinkling of spice could keep spoilage at bay. Yet the reality was more complicated. Spices did play roles in slowing decay, but often their greatest contribution was masking the flavors of food that was already past its prime. The belief in spices as preservatives stemmed partly from experience. Many spices, especially those rich in essential oils, have antimicrobial properties. Garlic, mustard, clove, cinnamon, and oregano, for example, contain compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. In warm climates, where food spoiled quickly, the liberal use of spices seemed to delay decay. This gave rise to the idea that spices were protective as well as flavorful. When meat began to turn, spices could make it more palatable, disguising the sour or gamey notes. Whether they truly preserved the food or simply made it more tolerable, spices became essential companions in kitchens across the world. Trade in spices shaped history itself. The fabled Silk Road carried spices from Asia to Europe, enriching merchants and fueling cultural exchanges. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves and nutmeg from the Moluccas, these were not just luxuries, but necessities in the eyes of those who believed them vital for preservation. Wars were fought for control of spice islands. Empires rose and fell over these tiny but powerful goods. In medieval Europe, spice chests were symbols of wealth, their contents locked away like treasure. A family able to season salted meat with cinnamon or clove was not only feeding themselves, but declaring status. In truth, spices were not as effective at long-term preservation as salt, smoke, or drying. They lacked the sheer transformative power of those methods. But they had other advantages. Many spices helped mask the bitterness of salted or cured foods, adding complexity to otherwise monotonous diets. A slab of heavily salted pork might be harsh and unpleasant, but with pepper, mustard, or garlic, it became more palatable. In this sense, spices extended preservation indirectly not by keeping food fresh longer, but by making preserved foods more appealing to eat, encouraging people to rely on them without complaint. The cultural and symbolic roles of spices extended beyond preservation. They were linked to medicine, ritual, and even morality. In medieval Europe, Physicians prescribed spices as treatments for illnesses, believing their warming qualities balanced the body's humors. Nutmeg was thought to ward off the plague, cinnamon to strengthen the heart, pepper to stimulate digestion. These beliefs added to their value, making spices indispensable not only in kitchens but in apothecaries. To store food with spices was to infuse it with supposed healing power, blending preservation with protection. In many parts of the world, spice-heavy preservation methods became staples. In India, meats and vegetables were marinated in mixtures of spices, salt, and sometimes yogurt, then cooked or dried. Their longevity increased by the antimicrobial effects of turmeric, garlic, and chili. In North Africa, preserved lemons were submerged in salt and spices, creating a staple that lasted for months and flavored countless dishes. In Eastern Europe, spiced vinegars and brines added layers of taste to preserved vegetables. Each culture, adapting to local resources, found ways to fold spices into preservation, whether for real protection or for sensory delight. The demand for spices reshaped global economies and diets. By the Renaissance, European kitchens brimmed with recipes calling for exotic seasonings. A feast might feature salted meats dressed in cinnamon, dried fruits simmered with cloves, or fish preserved with pepper and vinegar. These combinations were not only about taste, they represented the reach of trade, the wealth of the household, and the ability to transform preserved foods into culinary statements. Spices carried stories of distant lands, linking humble village tables to the great networks of global commerce. There is also the question of myth. For centuries, it was repeated that medieval Europeans used spices to disguise spoiled meat. While it is true that spices could mask off flavors, the idea that people routinely ate rotten food is an exaggeration. Preservation methods like salting and smoking were effective, and spoiled food could still cause illness. Most households could not afford to waste precious spices on food already gone bad. Instead, spices were used to enhance already preserved food, making it tastier and perhaps helping at the margins to slow decay. The myth itself, however, underscores how deeply spices were associated with preservation, even if the reality was more modest. The economic and political consequences of spices as preservatives were enormous. The Portuguese, Dutch, and British all sought control over spice-producing regions, leading to colonization, wars, and immense suffering for the people of those lands. The thirst for spices in Europe was partly fueled by the belief that they could keep food safe and palatable, a belief that gave empires the justification to risk oceans and spill blood for tiny buds of clove or shards of cinnamon bark. Preservation was never a simple story. It was tied to global currents of power, desire, and exploitation. Imagine a medieval European feast. The meat served is salted, perhaps smoked, sturdy enough to last through the months since the last slaughter. But the true glory of the meal is in the spices. Pepper dusts the pork, cinnamon scents the stewed fruit, nutmeg grates over pies. Guests marvel not at the freshness of the food, but at its richness, its transformation by distant treasures. The spices do not preserve the food as salt did, but they preserve its appeal, carrying the taste of exotic lands into the heart of the hall. Each bite is both sustenance and spectacle, proof of wealth and connection to the wider world. Spices also preserved memory and identity. Families passed down spice blends, recipes that linked generations. A grandmother's recipe for spiced pickles, or a father's cure of meat with garlic and mustard, was not only about food, but about continuity. Even today, spice mixes like garam masala, ras el hanout, or za'atar reflect centuries of preservation practices, encoded in flavor rather than architecture or technique. To taste them is to taste the preservation methods of ancestors, alive in every kitchen that uses them. Today, we no longer rely on spices for preservation, but they remain essential to our cuisines. We still pickle with garlic and chili, still preserve lemons with salt and spices, still drink mulled wines infused with cloves and cinnamon. The belief that spices preserve may no longer drive global empires, but their role in extending flavor and memory persists. In every jar of spiced chutney or bottle of seasoned vinegar, we glimpse the long history of how humanity fought spoilage, not only with chemistry, but with creativity. From the fragrant world of spices, we turn to another crucial element of preservation: containers. For even the best salt, smoke, or spice would be wasted without the vessels that held and protected food. In the next chapter, we will explore how clay jars, amphorae, and ceramic storage shaped the survival of civilizations. In the long history of food preservation, one often overlooked but absolutely essential element was the container. Preservation was never only about methods like salting, drying, or fermenting. It was also about where and how food was kept. Without reliable storage vessels, the work of preserving food could be undone by moisture, insects, or simple exposure to the air. Among the most important of these vessels were clay jars, amphorae, and ceramic containers. They were the silent guardians of human sustenance, enabling people to carry food across oceans, store it through harsh winters, and trade it across empires. These containers, humble in appearance, were in truth as vital to survival as the food they held. Clay was among the first materials humans learned to shape for storage. Fired in simple kilns, clay hardened into durable vessels that resisted decay, pests, and weather far better than baskets or skins. From Neolithic villages to great empires, clay jars became indispensable. They could hold dried grains, salted meats, pickled vegetables, or fermented drinks, protecting them from rodents and keeping them cool. Archaeologists uncovering ancient settlements often find fragments of pottery, the remains of these guardians of food. Their ubiquity tells us just how central they were to daily survival. The amphora, perfected by the ancient Greeks and Romans, is perhaps the most iconic of these vessels. Tall, narrow, with two handles and a pointed base, amphorae were designed not just for storage, but also for transport. Their shape allowed them to be stacked tightly in ships, the pointed bases fitting into racks or sand for stability. Amphorae carried olive oil, wine, fish sauce, and grains across the Mediterranean and beyond, forming the backbone of ancient trade. Stamped with marks that identified their origin, they were also early tools of branding and quality control. To drink wine from an amphora stamped with a particular Sidious mark was to taste both preservation and reputation. Ceramic jars also played crucial roles in fermentation. In Korea, ongi jars were used for fermenting kimchi and soy sauce. Their porous walls, allowing just enough airflow to encourage the growth of beneficial microbes while keeping out contaminants. In China, large clay jars held soy sauce, rice wine, and pickled vegetables, standing in courtyards where the sun and air slowly transformed their contents. In the Middle East, earthenware jars stored dates and olives, while in Africa, porous ceramic vessels kept water cool through natural evaporation. These jars were not merely containers, they were part of the preservation process itself, shaping the taste and texture of what they held. The design of ceramic containers reflected both practicality and artistry. Lids were often sealed with wax, cloth, or layers of oil and fat to keep out air. Some jars were glazed inside to make them impermeable to liquids, while others were left unglazed to allow subtle interactions with their contents. Amphorae were sometimes coated with resin to prevent wine from seeping or spoiling, which also gave the drink distinctive flavors. The balance of utility and craft meant that these vessels were not only functional, but also beautiful, decorated with patterns and inscriptions that revealed cultural identity. To store food was not only survival, it was also an expression of artistry. The economic importance of ceramic storage cannot be overstated. Amphorae full of olive oil or wine were valuable commodities, traded across thousands of miles. Roman fish sauce, or garum, was shipped in vast quantities in amphorae, feeding both soldiers and citizens. In Egypt, Granaries were lined with jars of grain, each one a measure of security against famine. These vessels made trade and taxation possible, as governments collected food in jars that could be stored, transported, and redistributed. Without reliable containers, the surplus food that fueled cities and empires would have been impossible to manage. Ceramic storage also connected households to the rhythms of preservation. Imagine a family in a medieval village. After salting pork and drying apples, they placed them in jars, sealing them with wax or cloth. These jars lined the shelves of a cool cellar, their contents waiting for the months ahead. Each jar was a promise, a small insurance policy against hunger. Opening one was a moment of trust, revealing whether the preservation had succeeded. A jar that smelled sour or moldy was a loss. One that opened to wholesome food was a triumph. Families lived in close relationship with these vessels, depending on their silence and sturdiness. The endurance of ceramic storage is evident in archaeology. Amphorae have been found in shipwrecks, still holding residues of wine, oil, or fish sauce after 2,000 years. The presence of these vessels on every continent shows how universal their value was. From Roman amphorae to Chinese pickle jars, from Middle Eastern date vessels to African water pots, ceramic storage was a global technology, invented and reinvented wherever clay and fire were available. The common thread was the human need to keep food safe from time and decay. Ceramic vessels also played symbolic roles. In many cultures, jars were associated with abundance and fertility. They appeared in myths and rituals, representing the womb of the earth or the container of divine gifts. The Greek myth of Pandora's jar, often mistranslated as box, is one example, linking the vessel to both hope and danger. In other traditions, burial offerings often included jars of food and drink, intended to sustain the dead in the afterlife. These vessels carried not only physical sustenance, but also spiritual meaning. The resilience of clay jars and amphorae also meant they were tools of memory. Unlike wooden barrels or leather bags, which decayed quickly, ceramics endured. A broken amphora could remain for millennia, its fragments whispering stories of ancient harvests and feasts. Today, archaeologists study the residues inside these jars to learn about ancient diets and trade. A single amphora shard can tell us what people ate, where they traded, and how they lived. In this way, ceramic storage preserves not only food, but also history itself. Picture a bustling Roman port. Ships arrive laden with amphorae, their pointed bases jutting upward from the hold. Workers unload them, stacking them in warehouses where rows of vessels stretch into the shadows. Each one contains olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, or grain from Egypt. These amphorae are more than jars. They are arteries of the empire, carrying sustenance and wealth across the Mediterranean. Without them, Rome could not feed its citizens or its legions. The amphora was as vital to Roman power as the legionary's sword or the engineer's aqueduct. Even in modern times, the legacy of ceramic storage endures. Wine is still aged in clay amphorae by some vintners, reviving ancient methods for their unique effects on flavor. Olive oil is sold in ceramic cruets, echoing millennia-old traditions. In many rural areas, clay jars still store water, milk, or pickled vegetables, their porous walls providing natural cooling. Though plastics, glass, and metals have replaced ceramics in most modern kitchens, the principle remains. Storage is as critical as preservation itself. Clay jars, amphorae, and ceramic vessels remind us that preservation is not only about transformation, but also about protection. They are the unsung heroes of history, the silent partners that made survival, trade, and civilization possible. Without them, salted meats would have spoiled, wines would have turned, and grains would have rotted. With them, humanity could plan, share, and thrive. From the sturdy silence of amphorae and jars, we turn now to the sea, where preservation was not only a household task, but a global industry. In the next chapter, we will explore how preserved fish stockfish, bacalhau, kippers, and more fed cities fueled exploration and shaped the diets of entire civilizations. Of all the foods that demanded preservation, fish may have been the most important for connecting distant regions and fueling global trade. Unlike grain, which could be stored dry, or fruit, which could be dried or pickled, fish spoiled astonishingly fast once caught. A haul from the sea could turn from nourishment to waste in a single day. Yet fish was essential. It provided protein, vitamins, and fat for populations that often lived far from the coast. The solution was preservation, and the methods developed to save fish from spoilage salting, drying, and smoking became engines of commerce that reshaped economies, diets, and even geopolitics. From Norse stockfish to Portuguese bacalhau, from Dutch herring fleets to Japanese sushi traditions, preserved fish became the lifeblood of global exchange. One of the earliest and simplest methods was drying. In the cold, windy climates of Scandinavia, fishermen discovered that cod hung on racks in the open air hardened into stockfish. Without added salt or smoke, the cold winds alone dried the flesh until it was stiff and nearly immortal. Stockfish could last for years if kept dry, making it an ideal food for trade and travel. Viking ships carried stockfish across northern seas, sustaining crews on voyages that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. Later, stockfish became a staple in Catholic Europe, where demand for fish soared during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. The humble dried cod, stiff as wood, became a cornerstone of medieval trade. Salting took preservation to another level. By rubbing fish with salt and packing it into barrels, fishermen could extend its life dramatically. Salted fish was lighter and easier to transport than fresh fish, and it resisted spoilage even in warmer climates. This method revolutionized fishing in regions like the Iberian Peninsula, where Portuguese and Spanish fleets ventured into the Atlantic to harvest cod. They salted their catch heavily, producing bacalhau, which could travel across oceans and feed entire populations for months. Bacalhau became not just a food, but a cultural identity, woven into Portuguese cuisine with recipes that survive to this day. It was also an economic powerhouse, traded throughout Europe and beyond. The Dutch perfected yet another technique, pickling herring in brine. In the 15th century, a Dutch fisherman named Willem Buckelzoon developed a method of gutting and brining herring that allowed fleets to process massive catches at sea. The fish, packed into barrels with strong brine, could be sold throughout Europe. This innovation fueled the rise of the Dutch Republic, turning herring into the fish that built an empire. Herring sustained armies, fed cities, and generated wealth that funded exploration and trade on a global scale. The humble fish, preserved in salt, became the backbone of Dutch power in the early modern world. Smoking also played a role in fish preservation. In England, Kipper's smoked herring became famous, while in other regions, salmon, eel, and mackerel were smoked for storage and trade. Smoking not only preserved the fish, but added flavor, creating delicacies that were prized as much for taste as for longevity. In Russia, smoked sturgeon and caviar became symbols of wealth, preserved luxury foods that traveled from the Volga River to the tables of European nobility. Fish preservation was not just about survival, it was also about creating flavors and identities that shaped cuisines. The importance of preserved fish was magnified by religion. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church mandated numerous fasting days when meat could not be consumed. Fish, however, was permitted, and so the demand for preserved fish skyrocketed. Markets thrived on salted cod, pickled herring, and smoked eel, all of which could be stored and transported far from the sea. The rhythm of the liturgical calendar shaped diets, and preserved fish ensured compliance with religious rules while feeding populations. Without preservation, these religious practices would have been nearly impossible to maintain on such a large scale. Preserved fish also fueled exploration. European ships venturing into the Atlantic or around Africa relied on barrels of salted fish to feed their crews. Without durable rations, long voyages would have been impossible. Portuguese sailors carried bacalhau, while Dutch and English crews depended on herring and salted cod. These foods, dense in calories and protein, sustained the men who charted new sea routes, established colonies, and connected continents. The age of exploration, in many ways, was powered by preserved fish. Beyond Europe, fish preservation shaped cultures in Asia and Africa as well. In Japan, fish was fermented with rice to create early forms of sushi, originally developed not as a delicacy, but as a preservation technique. The rice, packed around the fish, fermented and produced acids that protected the flesh. In West Africa, dried and salted fish became central to diets and trade, moving along caravan routes into the interior. In the Caribbean, salted cod imported from Europe became a staple, integrated into local cuisines in dishes that remain beloved today. Everywhere the sea met human ingenuity, fish preservation created not only survival, but enduring culture. The economic impact of preserved fish was immense. Entire towns and industries grew around it. In northern Norway, cod fisheries supported generations, their wooden racks of drying fish becoming iconic landscapes. In New England and Newfoundland, cod fisheries supplied Europe with endless bacalhau, their prosperity tied directly to European fasting traditions. In Holland, herring fleets became engines of wealth, their brine-filled barrels funding the Dutch Golden Age. Fish preservation was not a minor practice. It was the foundation of entire economies, shaping global trade networks that spanned oceans. Yet preserved fish was not only about commerce. It also shaped identity and memory. For Portuguese families, bacalhau was not just food but tradition, appearing at Christmas dinners and family feasts. For Scandinavians, stockfish connected modern tables to Viking voyages. For Caribbean communities, salted cod became a reminder of both hardship and resilience, a legacy of colonial trade turned into cultural pride. Each preserved fish dish tells a story of adaptation, survival, and transformation, turning necessity into heritage. Imagine a bustling European port in the 17th century. Ships arrive from the northern seas, their holds filled with barrels of salted cod. Merchants haggle over prices, while dock workers roll the barrels into warehouses. In nearby markets, fishmongers sell smaller portions to townspeople preparing for Lent. In taverns, sailors feast on salted herring, washed down with ale. The air smells of brine and smoke, the scent of preservation that sustains entire cities. In those barrels lies not just fish, but the very possibility of urban life, exploration, and empire. Today, preserved fish remains a cultural treasure. Portuguese bacalhau dishes, Scandinavian stockfish recipes, Dutch herring festivals all celebrate traditions rooted in the struggle against spoilage. Though refrigeration has lessened the necessity, the flavors endure, reminders of a time when survival depended on ingenuity and trade. Every bite connects us to centuries of labor, voyages, and resilience. From the salty seas and drying racks of fish preservation, we turn next to the dairy fields, where another fragile food milk was transformed into lasting forms. In the next chapter, we will explore how butter, ghee, and especially cheese became powerful tools of preservation, sustaining communities and creating some of the most beloved foods in the world. Few foods are as fragile as fresh milk. Left at room temperature, it spoils within hours, turning sour and unsafe to drink. For ancient communities who relied on herds of cows, goats, sheep, or camels, this fragility posed a serious problem. How could they harness the nourishment of milk if it vanished so quickly? The answer was preservation, transforming milk into forms that could last days, weeks, or even years. Through butter, ghee, and above all, cheese, humanity discovered that milk could be tamed, preserved, and carried across seasons, landscapes, and generations. These techniques not only safeguarded food, but also gave rise to some of the world's most beloved traditions. The earliest method of preservation was likely accidental: fermentation. Milk stored in animal skins or clay jars would naturally ferment, turning sour and thick. Instead of discarding it, people consumed it, discovering that sour milk lasted longer than fresh milk and was easier to digest. From this beginning came yogurt, kefir, and other fermented dairy products, staples in regions from Central Asia to the Middle East. These foods were nourishing, portable, and safe, laying the foundation for more deliberate methods of dairy preservation. Udder was another revelation. By churning milk or cream, people separated the fat from the liquid, producing a rich, dense food that lasted longer than milk itself. Butter could be salted to extend its shelf life further, becoming a reliable source of fat and flavor through the winter. In colder regions of Europe, butter became central to diets, often stored in barrels or pots in cool cellars. In Ireland and Scotland, butter was sometimes buried in peat bogs, where the cool, oxygen-poor environment preserved it for years, so effectively that archaeologists have recovered bog butter still intact after centuries. These discoveries show just how resourceful and imaginative people were in their quest to make milk last. In warmer climates, butter was less stable. There, people developed ghee, or clarified butter. By gently heating butter and removing the milk solids and water, they produced a pure fat that resisted spoilage, even in hot conditions. In India, ghee became not only a staple of the kitchen, but also a sacred substance, used in rituals, lamps, and offerings. Its durability made it invaluable for trade and storage, while its rich flavor infused countless dishes. Ghee is an elegant solution to the problem of milk's fragility, turning a fleeting liquid into a fat that could last for months without refrigeration. But it was cheese that became the most transformative preservation method. The discovery of cheese is shrouded in legend. One story tells of a traveler carrying milk in a pouch made from an animal's stomach. The natural rennet enzymes in the stomach lining caused the milk to curdle, separating into curds and whey. The curds, once drained and salted, became the first cheese. Whether or not this story is true, it captures the essence of cheesemaking, transforming milk into a solid form that resists spoilage and grows richer with age. Cheese-making spread rapidly across cultures, each region adapting the process to its environment and resources. In the Mediterranean, feta was brined to last through the heat. In Northern Europe, hard cheeses like cheddar and Gouda developed, able to age for months or years. In the Middle East, salty cheeses provided nourishment in arid landscapes. In the Himalayas, yak milk was turned into hardened cheeses that could endure the rigors of mountain life. Each cheese was a solution to the same problem: how to preserve the fleeting gift of milk. The genius of cheese lay not only in its preservation, but in its variety. By adjusting techniques, adding salt, aging in caves, pressing curds, or washing rinds, people created cheeses with astonishingly different flavors and textures. Preservation turned into art, and necessity into identity. Entire regions became defined by their cheeses: Parmesan from Italy, Roquefort from France, Stilton from England, Mancebo from Spain. These cheeses were not just foods, but symbols of place and heritage, proof that preservation could produce not only safety but beauty. Cheese also became vital for trade and economy. In medieval Europe, monasteries perfected cheese-making, producing wheels that could be sold in markets or stored for lean years. Cheese fed armies, sustained peasants, and traveled along trade routes. Hard cheeses were especially valuable, durable enough to survive journeys without spoiling. Ships carried wheels of Parmesan and cheddar across seas, ensuring crews had nourishment for weeks. Cheese was not only sustenance, but also currency, traded and taxed like grain or salt. The nutritional benefits of preserved dairy were profound. Cheese and butter provided dense calories, fat, and protein, essential in times of scarcity. Fermented dairy products also made milk digestible for those who were otherwise lactose intolerant, a common condition among adults in many regions. Preservation thus expanded the usefulness of milk, turning it from a fragile food into a lasting foundation of diets. Entire populations could rely on dairy not just for days, but for months and years. Cultural and spiritual meanings also attached to dairy preservation. In India, ghee was considered sacred, used in religious rituals as a symbol of purity and abundance. In Europe, butter was tied to festivals and customs, sometimes sculpted into decorative shapes for Easter celebrations. Cheese featured in myths and proverbs, celebrated as a gift of the gods or a mark of rural prosperity. The transformation of milk into durable forms carried symbolic power as well as practical benefit, linking preservation to identity and meaning. Imagine a medieval monastery in France. In cool, dark cellars, wheels of cheese line the shelves, slowly aging under the watchful care of monks. Each wheel represents weeks of labor and months of security, food that will sustain the community through winter or provide income at market. Nearby, barrels of salted butter rest in storage, ready to be opened when the weather grows cold. For these monks, preservation is both discipline and devotion, their quiet labor transforming fragile milk into enduring sustenance. Centuries later, the flavors of those cheeses remain, a living memory of preservation. The endurance of dairy preservation is visible even today. Butter, ghee, and cheese remain central to global cuisines, cherished not for their necessity, but for their taste. We no longer bury butter in bogs or rely on cheese to survive a harsh winter, but we still celebrate these foods as delicacies and staples. The refrigerator may have eased their preservation, but their essence remains unchanged. They are the products of ingenuity, the triumph of human craft over the fragility of milk. Dairy preservation reminds us that food storage was never only about survival. It was also about creating richness, identity, and joy. From the creamy texture of butter to the golden clarity of ghee, from the sharp tang of aged cheese to the mellow softness of fresh varieties, these preserved foods show how necessity gave birth to some of the most beloved tastes in the world. From the cellars of monasteries and the hearths of households, we now turn to the march of armies and the voyages of explorers. In the next chapter, we will see how preserved foods dried, salted, smoked, and stored fed soldiers and sailors, shaping the course of wars, discoveries, and empires. Throughout history, armies and explorers have been limited not only by their weapons, ships, or strategies, but by their stomachs. The success or failure of campaigns, the reach of empires, and the survival of voyages often hinged on one crucial factor: food. More specifically, food that could endure time, distance, and hardship without spoiling. Preserved foods, whether salted, smoked, dried, pickled, or fermented, were the hidden allies of soldiers and sailors, quietly shaping the destinies of nations. To study war and exploration is to study preservation, for without it, armies would starve, navies would collapse, and the map of the world would look very different today. The ancient world offers countless examples. The Roman legions, famed for their discipline and organization, marched not only with weapons, but with preserved foods. Salted pork, hard cheeses, dried grains, and vinegar provided sustenance for soldiers on long campaigns. The ability to transport food across great distances allowed Rome to extend its reach, maintaining armies far from home. Vinegar, in particular, was mixed with water to make a drink called posca, safer than plain water and more refreshing under the Mediterranean sun. The Roman military machine depended on its granaries and preserved rations as much as on its legions of soldiers. Centuries later, medieval knights and their armies relied on similar strategies. Salted meats, dried fish, and hard biscuits were staples of military campaigns. During the Crusades, European armies marching into the Levant carried barrels of salted pork and fish, often supplemented by dried fruits and wine. Preservation allowed them to move across hostile lands where supplies could not be guaranteed. Castles under siege survived by relying on their granaries and preserved stores. The ability to hold out against starvation often determined whether walls fell to attackers or remained standing. Food preservation was as much a weapon of defense as stone fortifications. Exploration, too, was inseparable from preservation. When Europeans set sail across the Atlantic, they faced journeys that could last months without access to fresh supplies. Salted fish, hardtack, a hard, dry biscuit, dried beans, and barrels of water made these voyages possible. Without them, Columbus could not have crossed the ocean, nor could Magellan have circumnavigated the globe. Yet these rations were far from ideal. Hardtack often became infested with weevils, and salted meat could be tough and unappetizing. Worse, the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables led to scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that killed more sailors than storms or battles. It was only when preserved foods like sauerkraut and citrus were introduced that scurvy was finally controlled, changing the fate of naval exploration forever. The age of sail saw preservation elevated to global significance. Portuguese fleets carried bacalhau, or salted cod, across oceans, while Spanish galleons relied on dried beans, wine, and preserved meats. Dutch herring fleets supplied Europe with brined fish, feeding both sailors and armies. In England, barrels of salted beef became so central to naval life that sailors were nicknamed limeys, when lime juice was later added to their rations to prevent scurvy. The connection between preservation and power was clear. Those who could feed their navies could dominate the seas. Armies on land faced similar challenges. During the Napoleonic Wars, French soldiers marched with hard bread, salted meats, and dried legumes. Napoleon himself famously declared that an army marched on its stomach, recognizing that logistics and preservation were as crucial as tactics. His wars highlighted the need for innovation, leading to the development of canning, a method that would revolutionize preservation in the 19th century. The search for better preserved food was not a luxury, but a necessity of empire. In the Americas, preservation played a central role in exploration and settlement. Fur traders and pioneers carried pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries developed by indigenous peoples of North America. Lightweight, dense in calories, and long-lasting, pemmican was the perfect travel food, sustaining traders through harsh winters and long journeys. Without it, many expeditions into the interior would have failed. Similarly, in the Arctic, explorers relied on dried and salted foods, though often with tragic results when supplies ran low or spoiled. Preservation could mean the difference between discovery and disaster. The link between preservation and survival was equally strong in warfare. During the American Civil War, Union and Confederate soldiers alike depended on salted pork, hardtack, and coffee. Soldiers joked about the toughness of their rations, but they relied on them nonetheless. In World War I, tinned meats, biscuits, and preserved jams filled trenches, while in World War II, armies marched with canned goods, dehydrated milk, and powdered eggs. These modern conflicts built on ancient traditions, showing how preservation continued to evolve but never lost its centrality to human struggle. Preserved food was not only about feeding armies and explorers, it was also about morale. Soldiers far from home found comfort in familiar flavors: salted ham, dried sausages, or tins of jam that reminded them of family kitchens. Sailors on long voyages looked forward to special rations of rum or preserved fruit. Even in the harshest conditions, preserved foods carried memory and culture, connecting people to home and tradition. In this way, preservation was not only physical sustenance, but also emotional sustenance. Imagine a ship in the 17th century, rolling across the Atlantic. In the hold, barrels of salted fish and meat are stacked high, alongside casks of water and wine. Sailors gather on deck, chewing hardtack that crumbles into dust, their meals monotonous but reliable. Weeks later, when the barrels are opened again, the food is still edible, preserved by salt, smoke, and time. Without these stores, the ship would never have left port. The preserved foods are invisible sails, carrying the voyage forward as surely as the wind itself. The legacy of preservation in war and exploration remains with us. Modern militaries still rely on rations meals ready to eat, MREs, descendants of salted pork and hardtack, designed for durability and portability. Space exploration depends on freeze-dried foods and carefully sealed packages, echoing the challenges faced by sailors centuries ago. The principle is unchanged. To go far, humans must carry food that defies time. Preservation, whether through salt, sugar, or science, has always been the quiet partner of ambition. From the battlefields and sea routes where preserved foods determined the course of history, we now turn to the scientific revolution that transformed preservation forever. In the next chapter, we will explore the rise of modern methods in the 18th and 19th centuries, canning, pasteurization, and industrial innovations that redefined how humanity fought against spoilage. For thousands of years, food preservation relied on tradition, observation, and trial and error. People salted and smoked, pickled and dried, often without understanding why these methods worked, only that they did. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, something profound began to change. Preservation moved from mystery to science. No longer just the domain of households, villages, and monasteries, it became a subject of laboratories, experiments, and industry. Out of this transformation came canning, pasteurization, and new chemical techniques that redefined humanity's relationship with food. Preservation was no longer just survival. It was innovation, empire, and modernity. The story begins with a challenge. In the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte, locked in wars across Europe, recognized the problem of feeding armies on long campaigns. "An army marches on its stomach," he famously declared, and his government offered a prize of 12,000 francs to anyone who could invent a reliable method of preserving large quantities of food. The challenge captured the imagination of Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner. After years of experimentation, Appert discovered that sealing food in glass jars and heating them in boiling water kept the contents edible for months, sometimes even years. He had no knowledge of microbes. Louis Pasteur would not reveal their role until decades later, but Appert had stumbled onto the principle of sterilization. His method, published in 1810, became the foundation of canning, one of the most revolutionary breakthroughs in food history. Canning quickly spread. Though glass jars were fragile, innovators soon developed tin-plated iron cans, sturdier and easier to transport. The British Navy adopted canned goods, providing sailors with meat, vegetables, and soups that could last through long voyages. By mid-century, canning factories dotted Europe and America, their clattering machines filling tins with food that could be shipped around the world. Canned foods sustained armies in the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and countless colonial campaigns. What had once been seasonal abundance became, through canning, year-round supply. For the first time in history, people could eat foods harvested months earlier and half a world away. Yet canning was not without problems. Early cans were sealed with lead-based solder, causing widespread poisoning in some cases. The process was labor-intensive, and the lack of understanding about microbes meant that failures were common. Some cans spoiled silently, leading to illness when consumed. Over time, improvements in sealing, heating, and testing refined the process, turning it into the reliable industry we know today. By the late 19th century, canned peaches, beans, and soups were common household items, transforming diets and expectations. Preservation was no longer only about necessity, it was about convenience. Parallel to the rise of canning, came another scientific revolution: pasteurization. Louis Pasteur, a French chemist and microbiologist, transformed the understanding of spoilage by proving that microorganisms caused fermentation and decay. In the 1850s and 1860s, Pasteur's experiments showed that heating wine or milk to specific temperatures killed harmful microbes without destroying flavor. This process, later named pasteurization, became a cornerstone of modern food safety. Suddenly, the causes of spoilage were no longer mysterious forces, but identifiable organisms, and science offered a way to control them. Preservation was no longer trial and error. It was chemistry and biology applied with precision. Pasteur's discoveries had profound consequences. Milk, once a fragile and dangerous food, could now be consumed safely across entire cities. Outbreaks of diseases like tuberculosis, often spread through milk, were dramatically reduced. Beer, wine, and vinegar industries adopted pasteurization, ensuring consistency and stability in their products. The public gained trust in foods that had once been risky, and governments began to regulate preservation practices, embedding science into law. The world was moving into an age where food preservation was no longer artisanal, but industrial, no longer mysterious, but rational. Alongside canning and pasteurization, other innovations emerged. The 19th century saw the rise of chemical preservatives, such as nitrates, borax, and salicylic acid, used to extend shelf life. Some proved effective but dangerous, leading to debates about safety that foreshadowed modern food regulation. Refrigeration technology, still in its infancy, began to appear in ice-cooled railway cars and early mechanical cooling machines, hinting at the revolution to come. Drying and smoking, once purely traditional, were mechanized, producing foods on scales unimaginable in earlier centuries. The Industrial Revolution had reached the kitchen, and preservation became part of the machinery of modern life. The impact on exploration and empire was immense. Canned foods allowed armies to campaign in distant colonies, sustaining troops in climates where local supplies could not be relied upon. Explorers in the Arctic and Africa carried tins of preserved meat and vegetables, their survival tied directly to the new science of preservation. Merchants could ship canned fruits from California to Europe, bringing exotic tastes to Victorian tables. Preservation became globalization in practice, shrinking distances and expanding possibilities. But preservation was not only about power and trade, it also changed everyday life. In urban households, canned foods offered convenience to families no longer tied to seasonal harvests. A city dweller in London or New York could open a tin of peaches in winter, tasting summer months out of season. Preservation became a luxury of time, freeing households from the constant labor of drying, salting, and smoking. It also democratized diets, making foods once restricted to the wealthy available to broader populations. Preservation was no longer only survival, it was progress. Still, these innovations carried costs. Early canneries were often dangerous workplaces, with long hours and poor conditions for laborers, many of them women and children. The global demand for preserved foods encouraged industrial farming and exploitation of colonial resources. The same processes that fed armies and cities also entrenched inequalities, with the burdens of production falling on the marginalized. Preservation was, as always, a story of ingenuity intertwined with struggle. Imagine a late 19th century household. On the shelf sit tins of peaches, beans, and beef, their labels brightly colored with promises of freshness and safety. The family has never seen a peach orchard, but in midwinter they taste the sweetness of summer fruit, preserved months earlier and half a continent away. In the city outside, markets overflow with canned goods, their clatter and shine symbols of modern abundance. Behind it all lies the legacy of Apert's jars, Pasteur's experiments, and the factories that turned preservation into an industry. The 18th and 19th centuries marked a turning point. For millennia, preservation had been local, artisanal, and shaped by tradition. Now it was industrial, scientific, and global. Food was no longer bound by season or geography. It could be canned, pasteurized, and shipped across oceans. Preservation had moved from hearths and cellars to factories and laboratories, transforming diets, economies, and societies. From the scientific breakthroughs of the 19th century, we move now to the threshold of our modern age. In the next chapter, we will explore the arrival of refrigeration itself first through the global ice trade, then through early cooling machines, and how these innovations finally brought humanity into the era of true cold storage, changing preservation forever. As the 19th century drew to a close, food preservation entered a new age. For thousands of years, humanity had relied on salt, smoke, drying, pickling, and clever storage methods to fight spoilage. Then came the scientific revolutions of canning and pasteurization, which transformed how people preserved and consumed food. Yet one final frontier remained, the mastery of cold itself. Cold storage had been used in caves, cellars, and ice houses since ancient times. But now, with the rise of global trade and urban life, there was a demand for something more reliable, scalable, and permanent. The edge of modern refrigeration was not just a technical innovation. It was a cultural and economic revolution that forever changed how people ate, lived, and thought about time. The story begins with ice. In the early 19th century, a New England businessman named Frederick Tudor became known as the Ice King. He realized that natural ice, harvested from frozen lakes in winter, could be cut into blocks, insulated with sawdust, and shipped around the world. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Why would anyone in the Caribbean or India want frozen water shipped from Massachusetts? But Tudor proved the skeptics wrong. Ships laden with ice sailed to tropical ports, where the novelty of cold drinks and preserved foods became a sensation. Soon, the ice trade expanded, with massive blocks transported by rail and sea to cities that had never known reliable cold storage before. Tudor's empire showed that cold itself could be commodified, sold, and consumed. The ice trade reshaped diets and industries. Butchers, fishmongers, and berries could now store their products longer, expanding the reach of their markets. Urban households purchased iceboxes, wooden cabinets lined with tin or zinc, fitted with a compartment for a block of ice. Families could keep milk fresh for days instead of hours, meat for weeks instead of spoiling overnight. For the first time, perishable foods entered city kitchens in reliable supply. The humblest glass of cold water on a hot summer day was a marvel of global logistics, a reminder that ice harvested from a pond in New England could end up clinking in a glass thousands of miles away. Yet natural ice had limitations. Warm winters could reduce the harvest. Transporting heavy blocks was expensive and labor-intensive. Ice contaminated with bacteria or pollutants sometimes carried disease, turning a miracle into a hazard. As cities grew, the demand for cold outpaced what natural ice could provide. The stage was set for the next leap: artificial refrigeration. Inventors had long experimented with machines that could create cold by compressing and expanding gases. In the mid-19th century, breakthroughs in mechanical refrigeration began to appear. Early machines were bulky, expensive, and prone to leaks, but their potential was undeniable. Breweries were among the first to adopt artificial cooling, as beer required stable temperatures for fermentation. Soon, slaughterhouses, dairies, and shipping companies followed. By the late 19th century, refrigerated railcars carried meat from the American Midwest to eastern cities, while refrigerated ships transported beef from Argentina and lamb from New Zealand to European markets. Suddenly, fresh meat could travel across oceans, reshaping diets and economies. The cultural impact was profound. Foods once limited by geography became global commodities. A family in London could eat fresh beef from South America, fish from the North Atlantic, and fruit from the Mediterranean, all thanks to refrigeration. The rhythms of diet, once tied to local seasons, began to break apart. Oranges in winter, strawberries in spring, fresh milk in summer all became possible. Refrigeration collapsed distance and time, transforming food from a local resource into a global market. At home, the icebox remained the centerpiece of cold storage well into the early 20th century. Delivery men hauled heavy blocks of ice into kitchens, replenishing them weekly. The clink of ice against metal was a familiar sound in urban households, and children eagerly chipped off shards for summer treats. The icebox was both necessity and luxury, symbolizing modern life. Yet even as natural ice continued to dominate, the whisper of machines grew louder. In laboratories and factories, engineers refined compressors, improved insulation, and sought safer refrigerants. By the early 1900s, mechanical refrigeration was no longer an industrial curiosity, but a looming household reality. Refrigeration also changed the very idea of freshness. For millennia, fresh had meant immediate meat butchered that morning, milk drawn at dawn, vegetables picked from the field. Preservation was about transforming and adapting, accepting that food could not remain unchanged. But with refrigeration, freshness became a commodity that could be extended and sold. Consumers grew accustomed to buying milk that lasted days, fish that traveled miles, meat that no longer had to be salted or smoked. The desire for unaltered, fresh food became a cultural shift, made possible only by the invisible machinery of cold. This revolution also had darker sides. Refrigeration enabled the rise of industrial farming and global shipping, often at the expense of local producers. It expanded urban dependency on distant food sources, reducing resilience in times of crisis. It also raised new safety concerns, as improper refrigeration could mask spoilage until it was too late. Yet overall, the benefits outweighed the risks. Refrigeration reduced foodborne illness, diversified diets, and allowed cities to grow on scales previously unimaginable. Imagine a household in the late 19th century. In the corner of the kitchen stands an icebox, its polished wood gleaming. Inside, a block of ice chills bottles of milk, butter, and a cut of beef. Outside, the iceman delivers fresh blocks, his cart clattering along cobblestone streets. Across town, a butcher proudly displays cuts of meat kept cool by ice imported from hundreds of miles away. For the family sitting down to dinner, the preservation is invisible. They simply taste freshness unaware of the vast networks of trade, labor, and innovation that placed it on their table. By the early 20th century, mechanical refrigeration began to replace natural ice in earnest. Electric refrigerators appeared in households, at first expensive luxuries for the wealthy, but gradually spreading to middle-class homes. By the 1930s, they became common, reshaping kitchens and diets forever. The hum of the refrigerator replaced the clink of ice, signaling the arrival of modern convenience. The battle against spoilage had reached a new chapter, one in which cold was no longer borrowed from winter, but generated on demand. The edge of modern refrigeration was not a sudden leap, but a gradual transformation: ice houses to ice trade, ice boxes to compressors, and finally to the refrigerators we know today. It was the culmination of centuries of struggle, ingenuity, and persistence, each earlier method paving the way for the mastery of cold. With refrigeration, humanity had finally gained near total control over perishability. Spoilage, once an ever-present threat, became manageable. Survival became convenience. Preservation became modernity. From the triumph of refrigeration, we come to the end of our journey. In the closing section, we will reflect on the long arc of preservation, from drying food under the sun to the humming refrigerators in our kitchens today, and consider how these methods not only fed humanity, but also shaped its history, culture, and imagination. As we reach the end of this long journey, let us pause to reflect on what it truly means to preserve food. From the first grains hidden in clay-lined pits to the modern refrigerator humming in the corner of your kitchen, Humanity's story has always been about survival against time. Every technique, salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, pickling, sealing in honey, steeping in spirits, or chilling in ice, was born of necessity, but each one also gave birth to culture, trade, and identity. Preservation was never only about keeping food edible. It was about security for families through winter, about armies marching to distant lands, about ships daring to cross uncharted oceans, and about flavors that became the heart of traditions. To preserve food was to preserve life itself. Think of the ingenuity required. Without knowing about microbes or chemistry, our ancestors watched carefully, experimented patiently, and passed down knowledge through generations. They turned fragility into resilience, and in the process, they shaped civilizations. Empires rose on grain stored in vast silos. Towns thrived on salted fish, and monasteries became famous for cheese and wine. The refrigerator in your kitchen is not a miracle of convenience standing alone. It is the latest chapter in a story, stretching back thousands of years, a story written by countless hands that learned how to hold back decay, if only for a little while longer. So the next time you open your refrigerator, perhaps you'll see it with new eyes. Behind every carton of milk and jar of jam lies an ancient history of invention and endurance. Behind every spoonful of honey, wheel of cheese, or salted cod fillet lies a tale of survival, of people making do with what they had, and of turning necessity into art. The methods may have changed, but the desire remains the same, to make the abundance of today carry into tomorrow. Thank you for joining me tonight on this exploration of how people preserved food before refrigerators and beyond. I hope this journey has given you not only a deeper appreciation of history, but also a sense of calm as you drift into rest. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel History for Sleep, where we bring the past to life in ways that help you relax and unwind. And I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment sharing what periods of history fascinate you most, or when you like to listen. Do you find comfort in ancient empires, medieval towns, or the modern age on the cusp of change? Your thoughts help shape the journeys we take together. For now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and let history guide you gently into sleep. Good night.